We all know that people in the past lived very differently from us, but few realize how strange their daily habits could be. Some Umayyads slept on rooftops, even in winter. Others carried good luck bones in their pockets. And whole families used wind towers just to cool a single room. Tonight, we'll drift gently into that world of odd routines and forgotten customs. In today's video, we'll talk about the strange daily life of the Umayyad Caliphate. So let's not waste any time, and let's begin. And so, as we drift from the hush of the introduction, the night gently peels away, and the first hints of morning stretch across the sky of Damascus, a city that once sat proudly at the very heart of an empire. Before anything else, there is the quiet, a thin, delicate quiet that wraps itself around the still sleeping courtyards and shaded alleyways, soft as a woven shawl. The air is cool, touched by the last breath of the night wind drifting down from the anti-Lebanon mountains. It carries the faint scent of fig trees, the dusty sweetness of old stone, and the lingering hint of last night's cooking fires now reduced to cold ash. Then, without warning, yet without force, the call to prayer rises. A single muezzin's voice floats over rooftops of glazed tiles and pale mud brick, echoing through the narrow veins of the city. His voice is unhurried, stretching each note like a ribbon carried by the breeze. One by one, other calls join him from distant minarets, turning the city into a gentle choir. For a moment, Damascus feels suspended, neither fully asleep nor fully awake, existing in that tender space where dreams loosen their hold. Shutters creak open. A lone servant sweeps dust from a courtyard, sending soft spirals rising into the early light. A baker, already sweating despite the cool dawn, kneads dough with steady, practiced motions. The thump, thump, thump of his palms hitting the table sets a quiet rhythm. His ovens, shaped like clay domes, glow from coals banked overnight. Soon the first round loaves, puffed, warm, dusted with sesame, will fill the air with a smell that makes even sleepy officials walk a little faster. Nearby, a scribe hurries to wash his face in the courtyard fountain before heading to the palace complex. His mind is already racing. Names to record, petitions to review, letters to copy, messages to translate. He tightens his belt, adjusts his ink pot, and mutters a prayer for patience. In Damascus, the capital of the Umayyad world, paperwork began early and seldom ended before the stars returned. As the sky brightens, sparrows erupt from garden walls, darting between citrus trees and rooftop beams. Their chirping adds a cheerful counterpoint to the last echoes of the prayer. Water sellers, men who carry leather bags slung over their shoulders, start their rounds, tapping brass cups to announce themselves. In the palace district, guards change shifts, exchanging short greetings and rubbing sleep from their eyes. Some soldiers warm their hands over small braziers, the coal glow reflecting in their helmets. But not everything in Damascus stirs gracefully. Behind the northern gate, a donkey brays loud enough to wake an entire neighborhood. Two boys, chasing a runaway chicken, nearly collide with a cloth merchant setting up his stall. And deep inside a bathhouse, a tired attendant grumbles as he scrapes leftover charcoal from the floor, wondering why he didn't choose a quieter profession. Still, as the minutes pass, the city settles into its familiar morning rhythm. The Taqiyya mosques, the pigeons, circle lazily. The Barada River glimmers beneath the rising sun. The distant hum of travelers approaching from the desert road begins like a soft vibration under the earth. Yet no matter how busy Damascus becomes, its mornings always begin the same way. Slowly, with gentle layers of sound and scent unfolding like petals. There is a softness to it, the kind of peaceful opening that makes your shoulders loosen even as you listen from far away. And though this capital city awakens with a certain elegance, its morning habits are only one side of the Umayyad world. Because outside the city walls, beyond the gates, beyond the orchards, beyond the winding roads, other mornings begin very differently. While officials sharpen their pens in Damascus, nomads are already chasing stray goats across the dunes. While bakers pull hot loaves from their ovens, Bedouin families sip bitter coffee from blackened pots. And while the quiet order of the capital takes shape, the desert stirs with its own wild rhythm. So, as the last lanterns of Damascus fade in the rising glow of the sun, let us follow the wind outward, toward the dunes, the tents, and the rugged vastness, into a very different kind of morning. A morning where the empire awakens not with ink and bread, but with sand, hooves, and the sharp scent of dawn. And that is where our journey continues, in Chapter 2. As we drift away from the stone walls and shaded courtyards of Damascus, the city slowly dissolves behind us like a dream fading in daylight. The sounds soften, the smells thin out, and the wind becomes the main voice of the world. The roads narrow into trails. The orchards give way to open plains. And soon, the first dunes rise like sleeping giants beneath a pale, growing sky. Here, in the desert, morning awakens with a rhythm entirely its own. Before the sun even crests the horizon, a faint bleating breaks the silence. A cluster of goats stirs near a set, low, dark tents. Goats that seem infinitely skilled at bleating just loud enough to rouse everyone except the person actually responsible for watching them. A few sheep shuffle about as well, kicking up dust that drifts lazily in the cool air. In the Bedouin camps, the animals always wake first, though they never apologize for it. Nearby, inside a goat hair tent whose woven walls breathe with the wind, a woman kneels over a small clay hearth. She nudges warm embers back to life with practiced hands. Soon, the soft crackle of fire joins the pre-dawn stillness, and the faint scent of roasting coffee beans curls upward. These beans, dark and fragrant, are pounded with a rhythmic, steady tap, tap, tap against a stone mortar. This is no rushed city breakfast. This is a ritual, a comfort, and a heartbeat all at once. The first pot of kawa simmers quietly, filling the tent with an earthy aroma that could coax anyone from their blankets. A man stretches near the entrance, rubbing the sleep from his eyes as he watches the horizon glow with a slowly widening band of gold. He mutters a few lines of poetry under his breath, something simple about wind or sand or longing, because in the desert, poetry is a kind of breathing. Outside, a teenage boy claps twice and whistles, gathering the goats with surprising authority. A few stubborn ones wander the opposite direction, as if testing the limits of his patience. He shakes his head and follows, the soft crunch of sand beneath his feet echoing the eternal rhythm of people who have lived on this land far longer than any palace or city. Before long, the rest of the camp stirs. A baby cries. A leather water skin sloshes as someone lifts it, and two men review the day's planned movements, where to drive the herd, where the nearest shaded spot might be, where last night's wind left footprints too crisp for comfort. Life here is always a negotiation with nature, with weather, with the land itself. Yet despite its hardness, the desert sunrise carries a peace found nowhere else. Compared to the gentle bureaucracy of Damascus or the quiet discipline of a scribe sharpening his pens, the desert morning feels raw and unfiltered. There are no tiled courtyards here, no marble fountains reflecting the sky, no palace guards trading shifts. Instead, there is dust and fire and warm breath rising from animals. There is a vastness that shrinks all worries. There is a horizon without walls. And there is community, a close-knit, interwoven world where every voice matters, every gesture speaks, and even the smallest moment becomes part of the tribe's shared rhythm. Breakfast might be simple, but it is meaningful. A few dates, warm bread baked beneath sand, coffee poured into small cups that pass from hand to hand. With every sip, the world feels steadier. Yet even in their simplicity, these mornings hold their own fascinating strangeness. Bedouin hospitality demands generosity, even when resources are scarce. Poets sometimes duel with words long before anyone duels with swords. And the children, barefoot, sun-kissed, endlessly curious, carry stories and jokes that wander across tribes faster than caravans. As the sun finally rises, bright, bold, and unmistakably desert, the heat begins its slow, steady climb. Shadows shrink. The goats bleat once more, impatient to move. The tribe readies itself for the day, folding blankets, tightening ropes, and loading supplies onto camels whose grumbling announces their own displeasure with early mornings. But before we leave this place, take one last breath of its quiet rhythm. For though this world might seem far from the bustling gates of Damascus, it is part of the same empire, woven together by people whose lives, habits, and tastes shaped the Umayyad age in countless ways. And among those tastes were the foods and flavors that united city and desert alike. So, let us wander now from the shifting sands back toward the kitchens, markets, and cooking fires where the empire's appetite came alive. Chapter 3 awaits, where strange foods and even stranger eating habits begin to simmer. As we leave the desert dawn behind, the soft aroma of simmering kawa fades, replaced by something richer, bolder, and far more surprising. For if the mornings of the Umayyad world were shaped by sand and prayer and gentle light, its daily meals were shaped by flavors that crossed continents, customs that mixed tribes and cities, and habits that would certainly raise eyebrows today. Food, in the Umayyad age, was not just nourishment. It was identity, status, medicine, superstition, and sometimes, mystery. Imagine walking through a Damascus street at mid-morning, the sun warm, the stones beneath your feet glowing softly. You turn a corner, and suddenly the air shifts. Thick, with the smell of lamb stewing in clay pots, onions sizzling in oil, and spices floating on the breeze. Not just simple spices, but the great travelers of the ancient world: saffron from Persia, cinnamon from India, pepper from far-off islands, and cumin that scented entire neighborhoods. Some spices were more precious than gold. A pinch of saffron could buy you a small goat. A bowl of pepper might be worth a worker's weekly wage. But for the Umayyad elite, extravagant seasoning was not indulgence. It was sophistication. Wealthy households layered spices like artists layering paint, creating dishes so rich and aromatic that diners sometimes claimed they could smell a feast before they even entered the house. Yet not all dishes were luxurious. Some were practical desert-born creations: dried yogurt balls called kashk, hard as stone until soaked into a creamy broth, or sun-dried meat stripped thin and salted so heavily it lasted weeks, or flatbread baked beneath sand on hot desert days, then dusted off, hopefully thoroughly, before eating. Then there were the unusual combinations that seem odd today, but were beloved in their time. Lamb cooked with apricots, fish stewed with raisins, chicken glazed in pomegranate syrup. Sweet and savory collided constantly, as if the cooks refused to choose a single personality for their meals. And street food, yes, there was street food, was even stranger. Vendors walked alleys, carrying vats of fermented barley broth, bowls of chickpea porridge, or skewers of grilled liver seasoned with vinegar and coriander. Some sellers specialized in nothing but roasted seeds, cracked nuts, or honey-soaked pastries that stuck to your fingers long after the last bite. But perhaps the strangest part of Umayyad eating habits wasn't the food itself. It was what people believed about digestion. Physicians claimed that eating melons too quickly could confuse the stomach. Lentils were said to make people sad. Eating fish and milk together was considered dangerous. And hot foods and cold foods weren't about temperature. They were about temperament. A hot food could inflame your mood, your blood, or your dreams. A cold food could soothe you or make you sluggish. There were rules about how to sit, how fast to chew, which hand to use, how to hold a bowl, and even what foods were morally uplifting. Some scholars wrote entire essays about which dishes made a person more patient, more courageous, or more eloquent. Imagine choosing your dinner like choosing a personality outfit. Even hospitality had its culinary quirks. If a guest arrived, you were expected to feed them whether you could afford to or not. Travelers sometimes wandered from home to home, collecting meals like beads on a string. Declining food was nearly forbidden. It risked insulting your host, who would insist, plead, and occasionally beg that you eat just a little more. People in the Umayyad world ate for honor as much as for hunger. Yet food was more than custom. It was the engine of trade. The spices that filled the kitchens of Damascus traveled in caravans that crossed deserts. The honey used in pastries came from distant valleys. Wheat arrived in massive sacks from Egypt, barley from the plains, fruits from orchards scattered across 3 continents. To follow a single loaf of bread was to trace the arteries of an empire. And so, as the scents of stews and spices drift upward into the noon warmth, our journey moves from kitchens and hearths into the places where these ingredients gathered, mingled, and transformed into livelihood. Let us step now into the crowded, colorful, endlessly alive markets of the Umayyad world, where food did not just feed people, it fueled an entire civilization. Chapter 4 awaits. From the kitchens where spices danced and pots simmered, we step out into the open air, following the scents and sounds as they gather into something much larger. The heartbeat of the Umayyad world was not found in palaces alone, nor in desert camps, nor even in the quiet courtyards of early morning. It pulsed strongest in the bazaars, the sprawling, noisy, vibrant markets where every part of life collided in one great river of movement. Imagine the moment you enter a bazaar in Damascus, light dappling through woven awnings, the heat rising from sun-warmed stones, the murmur of hundreds of voices weaving together. Then the noise thickens. Merchants shout prices at passers-by. Traders from Persia argue over weights with local shopkeepers. Children dart between stalls, chasing each other or running errands. And somewhere, always somewhere, a vendor stirs a pot that smells better than anything you've eaten all week. The bazaar is a world of its own. Spice sellers sit behind pyramids of saffron, turmeric, sumac, and pepper, each mound glowing like powdered sunlight. One merchant dips his fingers into a basket of dried rose petals, rubbing them gently to release their scent. Another fans smoke from burning oud, not only to attract buyers, but to make his stall seem mysteriously luxurious. Across the lane, cloth merchants unfurl fabrics that shimmer in the light. Persian silks, Andalusian wool, Egyptian linen. They snap each cloth sharply so the sound echoes, hoping the crisp crack will draw attention. Every gesture is calculated. Every movement is strategy. Then there are the food sellers, trays of honeyed pastries dripping with syrup, bowls of olives in shades from green to midnight black, skewers of grilled liver steaming atop brazier fires. A man pushes a cart of roasted chickpeas, shaking it so loudly that it becomes impossible not to turn your head. And at the far end of the market, near the city gate, butchers call customers by name, waving cuts of lamb and beef as if they were prized trophies. But amid the chaos, there is order, strict, surprising order. Walking through the bazaar is a stern-faced figure wearing a plain robe, carrying a staff, and watching everything with sharp, hawk-like eyes. This is the muhtasib, the market inspector, and his authority reaches farther than most people dare imagine. He checks that bread is sold at the right weight, that scales are honest, that cloth is not falsely advertised, that sellers do not cheat, shout lies, or block the pathways. He even inspects the cleanliness of stalls. And if a butcher's table is unwashed, the muhtasib's lecture will be long and his penalties swift. People fear him, respect him, and sometimes secretly laugh about him. But without him, the bazaar would collapse into true chaos. His job is to maintain the delicate balance between lively commerce and outright disorder. And it is in these markets, here in Damascus, in Kufa, in Cordoba, that the empire becomes real. Goods from distant lands gather alongside local produce. Caravans unload bundles from Central Asia. Ships from North Africa bring oils and metals. The bazaar is the empire in miniature, every region represented in stalls separated only by thin planks of wood. But the bazaar is not merely the movement of goods. It is the movement of people. A scholar sits on a small stool, reading a book aloud to a crowd of curious listeners, his voice competing with merchants shouting deals. A fortune teller quietly lays out bones and charms behind a curtain. A beggar recites poetry for coins. A traveling musician plucks a lute with a soft, mesmerizing rhythm, hoping someone, anyone, with a few dinars might pause and listen. Ideas, gossip, philosophies, jokes, and stories flow through the market as easily as spices and fabrics. News from Khorasan arrives before official messengers. Rumors from Andalusia travel faster than caravans. Knowledge swirls and settles like dust in the sunbeams. And so, as we wander through these noisy lanes, dodging a donkey here, avoiding a water seller's splash there, we begin to sense that the bazaar is not only a place of commerce, but a place of minds meeting. A single conversation could change a belief. A single story could shift a mood. A single poem could spark a debate that lasts hours. It is from this vibrant crossroads of goods and voices that we now step gently into the quieter world of ideas themselves, into the nights where scholars, writers, and storytellers breathed life into the empire's imagination. With that, we drift into Chapter 5. As the bazaar's noise settles behind us, the chaos softening into a distant hum, we slip into a different rhythm, one that emerges when the sun sinks, the stalls close, and the city slowly exhales. For while merchants and butchers sleep, another community awakens. The scholars, scribes, poets, and storytellers whose nights stretched long before the world ever tasted coffee. In the Umayyad age, staying up all night to study was not only admirable, it was expected. But without coffee, tea, or even strong brewed drinks, their path to wakefulness was creative. Some scholars kept bowls of cold water at their side, dipping their faces into it whenever drowsiness crept in. Others chewed dates slowly, letting the sugar jolt them awake just long enough to finish another page of commentary or dictionary. A few paced in circles, whispering lines of poetry under their breath, as if walking could keep sleep from catching them. Lanterns glowed dimly in small study rooms, tiny flames flickering, shadows shifting across scrolls and leather-bound volumes. Ink pots sat beside piles of parchment, and the soft scratches of reed pens carried through narrow alleys like insects singing. And always there was muttering. Muttering of grammar rules, muttering of Quranic recitations, muttering of debates they would later unleash upon their peers. If you listened closely from outside their windows, it sounded like a chorus of sleep-fighting whispers. But not all the night belonged to the studious. Some belonged to the storytellers, the kusas, who gathered crowds in squares, mosques, and caravan stops. Their voices rose and fell in dramatic waves, weaving sagas so exaggerated that even camels seemed offended. They told tales of warriors who never lost a battle, tribes who rode storms like horses, merchants who outwitted jinn with nothing but clever rhymes. These were stories where facts were soft suggestions, stretched and twisted until they gleamed like polished brass. People adored them. Men leaned forward with wide eyes. Children clung to their mother's clothing. Travelers paused mid-journey to listen. Even skeptics, those who knew the tales were nonsense, could not resist a good storyteller who performed with the confidence of someone who believed every word he spoke. Some storytellers used props, wooden swords, bright fabrics, even small drums. Others relied on nothing but voice, gesture, and silence used like a blade. Scholars sometimes grumbled about them, complaining that they contaminated the masses with foolish legends. And yet those same scholars could be seen standing at the back of the crowd, arms crossed, pretending not to enjoy themselves as the storyteller reenacted a battle with heroic flourishes. The night was also filled with debate circles, small clusters of students sitting in courtyards, arguing about theology, law, poetry meters, or the meaning of a single rare Arabic word. These debates could last hours, sometimes erupting into laughter, sometimes frustration, sometimes triumphant slaps on the knee when someone finally produced the perfect quote. And then there were the wandering poets. A lone poet might stand under a fig tree, composing verse aloud to the moon. Another would wander from house to house, reciting new lines to anyone who would listen, hoping to earn praise, coins, or, more likely, a polite request to recite later because everyone was trying to sleep. But poets were persistent. Words were their fuel, and night was their stage. Through all these gatherings, one thing remained constant: light. Lamps burning olive oil flickered on doorsteps, in study rooms, in mosque courtyards. The glow of nighttime Damascus, or Kufa, or Cordoba, was gentle, golden, and never quite steady. It illuminated faces bent over texts, hands gesturing wildly in debate, and eyes wide with anticipation as a storyteller reached the climax of a tale. And yet, outside these islands of activity, the city was drifting toward quieter hours. Homes darkened. The last vendors closed their shutters. The footsteps of late wanderers grew fewer. While scholars fought sleep and storytellers performed, ordinary families were settling into the shapes of their nightly routines. Because the night of the Umayyad world was not one night, it was many. The night of the scholar, the night of the storyteller, the night of the traveler, and the night inside the home, where conversations, chores, and dreams unfolded behind woven curtains and wooden doors. So now, let us slip away from the lamplight of scholarship and follow the night into those private spaces, the bedrooms, courtyards, and shared sleeping mats where families rested beneath the desert sky. Chapter 6 awaits. As we slip away from the lamplit circles of scholars and the echoing voices of storytellers, the night draws us inward, toward quieter worlds hidden behind wooden doors and woven curtains. Here, in the sheltered space of an Umayyad home, night takes on a gentler shape. It hums with domestic rhythms, the soft clatter of dishes being stacked, the murmur of last conversations, and the slow settling of a family preparing to rest. Most homes were simple. One or two rooms arranged around an open courtyard, the sky visible above like a dark bowl scattered with stars. In summer, people slept outside whenever they could, spreading mats beneath fig trees or on rooftops, where the night wind brushed their faces. In winter, everyone squeezed into the same room, gathering around small braziers glowing red with coals. The warmth was uneven, but the closeness created its own comfort. Sleeping arrangements were rarely private. Children, parents, grandparents, cousins, everyone shared walls, blankets, and dreams. Mats were unrolled at night and rolled away by morning. A single oil lamp burned low in the corner, its flame small and stubborn, casting shadows that swayed gently across plastered walls. Some families talked quietly as they lay down, short stories, reminders, whispered prayers, until the words dissolved into sleepy breaths. But sharing a home meant sharing everything, including challenges. Heat was the first one. In the summer months, the night air clung to the skin like a second cloak. People fanned themselves with palm leaves until their arms grew tired. They sprinkled water on mats to cool them. Children sprawled out like starfish, trying to find the faintest breeze. Some families slept in shifts, rotating spots on the coolest areas of the floor. Cold brought its own difficulties. Winter nights could be surprisingly sharp, especially in places like Kufa or northern Syria. Homes had no insulation. The desert didn't know how to hold warmth. Families huddled together, piling blankets and cloaks, sometimes using clay pots filled with heated stones as makeshift heaters. Bodies became the best source of warmth. So goats, dogs, and cats often ended up sleeping in the courtyards or even inside, whether invited or not. And then there were the insects. Mosquitoes hummed like tiny harps with bad intentions. Ants marched everywhere. Moths fluttered toward the lamp, throwing themselves at the flame in a baffling display of nighttime self-destruction. Some families hung woven screens or nets, but most simply waved the pests away and hoped for mercy. Livestock sometimes added to the chaos. A goat might wander into the courtyard, sniffing for leftover scraps, or a chicken might decide to sleep in a corner of the house instead of its coop. Children would shoo them away, only for the animals to return the moment the lamp dimmed. A donkey braying outside could jolt the entire family awake. A cat chasing a mouse across the roof tiles could sound like thunder. Yet amid this chaos, there was tenderness. A mother would adjust her child's blanket with a quiet tug. A father would place an extra mat under an elderly relative. A sibling would whisper a final joke into the darkness, earning a soft laugh that echoed through the courtyard. Night in an Umayyad home was noisy but full of affection, a shared experience that bound families together. And, like all nights, it had its rituals. Some people recited verses before sleeping, believing they would protect the home from harm. Others performed small ablutions or drank a final sip of water. A few families told short bedtime stories, funny, moral, or adventurous, depending on the teller's mood. When silence finally arrived, it came slowly, settling into the cracks of the home like a gentle guest. But silence in an Umayyad city never lasted long. Even as families closed their eyes, the outside world continued its restless conversation. Footsteps echoed through the alleys. A distant camel groaned. Guards called out from watchtowers. Vendors returning home rattled their carts long after midnight. And somewhere, always somewhere, a dog barked at nothing in particular. So before we drift too deeply into this domestic calm, let us lift our heads toward the open courtyard and listen to the world outside, the world that never quite sleeps. For in the next chapter, we step beyond the walls to discover the unexpected soundtrack of the Umayyad night. Chapter 7 awaits. As we rise gently from the courtyard of the Umayyad home, brushing the last traces of warmth and laughter from our ears, we step back into the open night. A night that was anything but quiet. For while families curled beneath blankets and children drifted into dreams, the cities of the Umayyad world carried on with their own restless soundtrack. Each city, each region, each corner of the empire possessed a signature night song, a tapestry of noises that blended together until people scarcely noticed them anymore. In Damascus, the night was punctuated by the voices of the Haras, the city guards patrolling the streets. They called out to one another from distant alleys and watchtowers, using set phrases that assured the city all was well. Their voices rose and dipped in the darkness, like a slow chant threading through narrow stone corridors. The calls echoed off walls and rooftops, a reminder that even in sleep, order was maintained. But the guards were not the loudest creatures awake. Stray cats roamed the streets with unapologetic confidence, their nighttime arguments echoing in all directions. They leapt across rooftops, hissed over scraps, and occasionally erupted into screeching alarm when surprised by a sudden movement. Their cries were so sharp and dramatic that a traveler unfamiliar with Damascus might think some mythical creature prowled the alleys after midnight. But locals barely flinched. They simply rolled over and continued sleeping. The Barada River added its own constant whisper, flowing beneath bridges where lovers sometimes lingered late, exchanging soft words beneath the moon. Lanterns hung from doorways, their flames trembling gently, slipped through the streets. A merchant, closing his shop late, would rattle his wooden shutters, creating echoes that bounced through the sleeping quarter like slow-moving ghosts. Farther east, in Basra, where palm trees swayed like dark silhouettes, the night had a softer hum. The waters of the Gulf carried distant splashes from fishermen returning late, their boats creaking softly as they docked. Sometimes, traders arrived at odd hours, unloading goods by torchlight when tides favored them. The shouts of sailors, the thud of crates, and the slap of ropes formed a rhythm all their own. Dogs barked in response, somewhere across the canals, creating a chain of noises that wound through the city like a playful thread. And then there was Kairouan, a land of desert winds and sacred stillness. At night, the wind itself became an instrument, rushing through courtyards, rattling wooden screens, and brushing against the massive walls of the great mosque. The call of nightbirds drifted across the dunes. Sometimes, caravans arrived just before dawn, the soft clinking of camel bells growing louder as they approached the gates. The muffled thump of hooves, the murmur of tired travelers, the settling groan of heavy loads being lowered onto the ground. These sounds signaled the arrival of goods, letters, and stories from distant lands. But night sounds weren't limited to cities. Across the empire, the movement of caravans created their own nighttime symphony. Camels grumbled deep, rumbling notes. Leather straps creaked. Caravan leaders barked quiet commands, guiding travelers under the moon's silver glow. The desert held sound differently, stretching it, softening it, cradling it until it blended with the sand and wind. People who lived in these cities learned to sleep through it all. The noise became familiar, almost comforting. A baby might wake from a sudden clatter, but adults would hardly stir. Some even found reassurance in the constant hum, proof that life continued, that neighbors were nearby, that the world was still turning. Silence, in fact, felt eerie. Too much quiet meant something was wrong. Even so, there were moments when the night grew brief pockets of stillness, when a guard paused his rounds, when the cats quieted, when the river calmed. These moments often came just before dawn, when darkness felt heaviest and the world seemed to hold its breath. And it was in those rare moments that the first spiritual stirrings of the morning began. Someone rose early to perform ablution. A faint clink of a water jug, a quiet clearing of the throat, a whispered verse in preparation for prayer. The transition from night's noisy tapestry to dawn's sacred calm began long before the call to prayer echoed across rooftops. So let us drift now toward that delicate shift, toward the rituals, the cleansing, the breaths of devotion that accompanied the first light of day. Chapter 8 awaits. As the final echoes of the night fade, and the air takes on that cool, pale softness that comes just before sunrise, the empire stirs in a quieter, more intentional way. Before the markets open, before bread is kneaded, before children tumble into the light with laughter, there is an intimate, almost universal rhythm that begins the Umayyad morning, the ritual of cleansing. For most people, the day did not start with food. It started with water. A clay jug, cool to the touch. A basin set near the courtyard well. A few handfuls poured carefully, deliberately. Wudu, the ritual washing before prayer, was both practical and spiritual. Faces splashed awake, hands rinsed, forearms cooled. Water trickled onto stone floors, making soft tapping sounds that blended with the faint chatter of early birds. Yet, alongside these essential rituals existed a surprising world of hygiene beliefs. Some wise, some baffling, some downright hilarious when seen through modern eyes. Bathhouses, for example, were popular social hubs. People gathered not only to clean themselves, but to talk, gossip, recite poetry, and exchange the latest theories about which herbs cured which ailments. One man might insist that rubbing olive oil on your scalp ensured long life. Another swore that a daily sniff of musk improved courage. A third would warn everyone that too much time in the steam room weakened the spirit and made a man forget his responsibilities. Perfumes were another essential part of daily life. Men and women alike anointed themselves with fragrant oils, rose, sandalwood, jasmine. So common were these scents that some homes smelled like miniature gardens even in the depths of winter. But people also believed in stranger aromatic practices, burning incense to clear bad air, wearing ambergris to strengthen memory, or carrying a tiny cloth soaked in vinegar to purify the nose from unpleasant smells. A few even believed that sniffing certain herbs made your dreams more truthful. Then there were the cleanliness superstitions. Some insisted never to cut nails at night, believing it invited misfortune. Others avoided washing hair before important events, fearing it could wash away blessings. Certain foods were labeled impure at specific times of day, not because of religion, but because an ancestor once claimed it made them feel strange. One widely shared belief warned people not to drink water too quickly after waking, because it could shock the spirit still lingering in sleep. Another insisted that sleeping with wet hair allowed jinn to whisper into your dreams. Even seasoned scholars chuckled at such ideas, yet many still secretly followed them. You never knew who might be right. Still, amid these curious notions, the Umayyad world took hygiene seriously. Water was precious, but used generously. Homes often kept small perfuming stations near the door for guests. Cleanliness wasn't just habit, it was identity. A person's scent, clothes, and grooming said as much about them as their lineage or profession. And after all the washing, oiling, brushing, and perfuming, came another important part of the morning: dressing. Choosing clothes in the Umayyad era was more than a simple matter of warmth or modesty. It was a statement, a message sent silently into the world. Colors carried meanings. Fabrics whispered status. The way someone wrapped their turban or tied their belt could hint at their tribe, profession, or political loyalties. But before we step into that world of robes and dyes, of silks and wool, of humble weaving and elaborate tailoring, take in one last glimpse of the morning rituals: the splash of cool water, the scent of rose oil rising from a palm, the quiet exhale of a person ready for another day. The sun climbs higher, shadows shrink, and freshly washed hands reach for freshly laid out garments. Let us now drift gently into the next part of our journey, where clothing speaks as clearly as words. Chapter 9 awaits. With morning ablutions complete and the soft scents of oil and incense lingering in the air, the next act of daily life unfolds: dressing. In the Umayyad world, clothing was not merely protection from heat or cold, it was language. A robe could tell a story. A turban could declare an allegiance. A color could whisper a person's rank, tribe, temperament, or piety long before they ever opened their mouth. Robes formed the foundation of most outfits: light, flowing, and endlessly practical. They draped over the body like fabric made of air. Some were simple: undyed wool or plain cotton that kept the heat at bay. Others shimmered with dyes so vibrant they seemed to glow: deep saffron yellows, indigo blues, and rich pomegranate reds. Dyed cloth was expensive, and the boldness of a color often reflected the boldness of the wearer. A wealthy merchant might wear a robe trimmed with silk threads, while a scholar favored muted tones that suggested humility. At least until he launched into a 3-hour debate, proving he was anything but humble. Turban styles varied even more. One could learn an entire catalog of social clues just by observing how someone wrapped the cloth around their head. A tight wrap suggested discipline or military life. A loose, elegant drape hinted at wealth or scholarly pursuits. Some men added a splash of colored fabric to signal tribal lineage, while others preferred pure white to evoke modesty. In some cities, you could identify a visitor instantly. Egyptians tied their turbans differently from Andalusians, and desert nomads wrapped theirs longer, protecting themselves from sand and sun. Footwear had its own subtle flair. Sandals made from camel leather, stitched with thick cords, were the practical choice. But the elite favored soft slippers that made almost no sound when walking. Perfect for palace courtyards, but rather dangerous on heavily polished floors. More than one governor learned humility after slipping in front of his servants. For women, clothing was equally expressive. Long dresses layered with lightweight veils allowed for modesty without sacrificing beauty. Jewelry played an essential role: bangles that chimed softly, necklaces of carved stone or glass, and rings engraved with names, blessings, or poetic lines. A well-dressed woman could express her entire personality through the spark of her earrings or the intricacy of her henna patterns. Tailoring habits also tell their own strange tales. Some robes were intentionally oversized because people believed loose garments made one appear dignified. Tight clothing, on the other hand, was frowned upon, thought to shrink a person's presence. A nobleman drowning in fabric was considered refined. A man whose sleeves ended too close to his wrists risked gossip. And then came the unusual fashion beliefs. Many insisted certain colors affected behavior. Green inspired calm. Red stirred bravery or trouble, depending on who was wearing it. Yellow lifted the mood, though some claimed it made children too energetic. Even the dyeing process carried myths. Artisans believed that whispering blessings over vats could make the colors richer. Whether superstition or style magic, people swore by it. Clothing was also political, sometimes dangerously so. Certain tribes favored particular fabrics or patterns, and rivals avoided those colors entirely. A man wearing the wrong shade of blue in the wrong neighborhood could spark days of argument. In some cities, wearing expensive silk was regulated. In others, it was discouraged as unnecessary pride. Yet people found ways around every rule, wearing silk in linings or mixing it with cotton so subtly that only experts could tell. Fashion was a kind of quiet rebellion, a coded declaration, a shimmering language that flowed through the streets. Even the humblest man, in his plainest robe, made choices each morning that tied him to centuries of tradition. And of course, someone had to keep watch over all of this. Not because fashion itself required policing, but because the markets where clothing was sold demanded order, honesty, and proper moral conduct. For every extravagant robe, every carefully wrapped turban, every artful stitch of embroidery, there was an official somewhere making sure sellers behaved. Customers weren't cheated, and public morality stayed intact. So now, let us step from the wardrobes and weaving rooms into the world of those who oversaw public behavior, the stern, surprising guardians of marketplace ethics. Chapter 10 awaits. From the colorful fabrics and carefully folded turbans of the morning wardrobe, we step back into the lively heart of the city, into the streets and markets where the true pulse of daily life thumps beneath the sun. But this time, we are not wandering as idle observers. No, we walk beside someone else now. Someone whose presence makes merchants straighten their backs, whose footsteps quiet whispered arguments, whose very gaze keeps the bazaar in order. This is the muhtasib, the market inspector, the guardian of public conduct, the quiet shadow watching over the empire's commerce and morality. He is not a judge, nor a soldier, nor quite a policeman in the way we imagine today. But he holds a peculiar authority that blends all three. At dawn, as merchants lift their shop shutters and sweep the dust from their thresholds, they offer him forced smiles and nervous greetings. Not because he is cruel, most muhtasibs were fair, but because everyone knew he could appear at any moment, pointing at a scale, a loaf of bread, or even a too loud vendor, and declare it unfit for respectable society. The muhtasib's first duty was simple: honesty. But this simple task unfolded in endless, amusing ways. He would stop at a butcher's table and check the weight of the meat, watching carefully to ensure no thumb pressed secretly on the scale. Then he might examine the butcher's knife, ensuring it wasn't used beyond its sanitary life. If the knife was dull or dirty, he would scold the butcher loudly enough that the entire street heard. A humiliation worse than a fine. Next, he might inspect a spice dealer's jars. If a merchant mixed old pepper with new to stretch profits, the muhtasib would catch it by smell alone. His nose was sharper than most dogs. Some even swore he could detect dishonesty faster than the scent of cumin. Bread was another matter entirely. Bread was life. Bread was dignity. And woe to the baker who tried to lighten his loaves by adding too much air or too little flour. The muhtasib often carried a small knife specifically for cutting bread open in front of customers. If a loaf was hollow or uneven, the baker endured a lecture about feeding the community properly, followed by either a fine or, far worse, the muhtasib's disappointed sigh. But his authority stretched well beyond food and weights. He monitored noise levels, reminding vendors to keep shouting to a respectable volume, a rule nobody agreed on, but everyone tried to guess. He ensured traders didn't block pathways with their stalls, reprimanding anyone who cluttered the streets with crates or lazy donkeys. He made sure sellers didn't cheat with false advertisements, like claiming their cloth came from Egypt when it clearly didn't. Some muhtasibs even inspected the spoons used by street vendors, checking that they were clean enough not to spread illness. He was also responsible for public behavior. If two merchants argued too loudly, he stepped in, reminding them that quarrels disrupted the dignity of the bazaar. If someone insulted a customer, he lectured them about courtesy. If beggars disrupted foot traffic, he found them a safer corner. And if a storyteller drew too big a crowd and blocked an alley, the muhtasib dispersed them with an authoritative wave. Though sometimes he lingered to hear the end of a particularly good tale. What made his role so strange was its mix of practicality and moral philosophy. He enforced laws, yes, but also values. He protected the flow of life as much as the fairness of goods. His presence shaped how people behaved, how loudly they spoke, how carefully they measured, even how neatly they arranged their stalls. In many ways, he held the city together. But his world hints at something broader, something more complex about order in the Umayyad Empire. Because if the marketplace required a watchful eye, then the streets beyond it needed something different. Rules, punishments, disputes, and the sometimes comical, sometimes profound struggles to maintain public order in a growing civilization. So let us follow his footsteps out of the bazaar and into the courts, alleyways, and judgment halls where ordinary arguments become extraordinary tales. Chapter 11 awaits. Leaving the muhtasib behind, his staff tapping against stone, his voice chasing dishonest merchants down the lane, we wander deeper into the civic nerves of the Umayyad world. Here, beyond the bustling markets, lies another realm where human behavior was scrutinized, judged, and occasionally scolded with remarkable creativity. It is the realm of courts, judges, complainants, defendants, and a long list of laws that ranged from wise to bewildering. Justice was a serious matter, but that didn't mean it was always predictable. Imagine a judge sitting on a woven mat beneath the shade of a large courtyard tree, surrounded by scribes, petitioners, and curious spectators who had nowhere better to be that morning. The Qadi, calm but stern, called one case after another. Some disputes involved land rights or inheritances, weighty matters that required careful thought. Others, well, others were the kind of cases that would make even the judge rub his forehead in disbelief. A merchant might accuse his neighbor of stealing his prized rooster. The neighbor, deeply offended, might counter-accuse him of slandering the rooster's character. The judge, without blinking, would then question the rooster's behavior as if the bird were a witness with a reputation to defend. In some records, judges even asked for descriptions of the rooster's personality, hoping to determine whether it seemed like a criminal. Punishments could also seem eclectic by today's standards. A man caught lying repeatedly might be paraded around the market carrying a sign that read, "Beware my tongue." Another might be seated backwards on a donkey, an ancient version of public shaming that somehow managed to humiliate both rider and donkey equally. For petty theft, some offenders were required to repay double the value of the stolen item. For more creative transgressions, the punishments became equally creative. There was once a case, often retold as a humorous lesson, of a man who borrowed his neighbor's cooking pot and returned it dented. When confronted, he claimed the pot had died of old age. The judge ordered him to compensate the neighbor with a new pot and a small bag of dates for mourning. The man protested the absurdity, but the ruling stood. After all, he was the one who invented the story of the pot's mortality. Legal loopholes, meanwhile, flourished like weeds in a garden. One scholar wrote of a clever debtor who insisted he could not repay his loan because he had lost the purse in which he kept the intention to repay. Another insisted that he only intended to break a contract, not actually break it. So he argued he should be judged only for intent, not action. Judges generally had little patience for such wordplay, though a few secretly admired the creativity before ruling decisively against it. Not all cases were comedic. Some were deeply philosophical, probing the boundaries of ethics, responsibility, and mercy. Judges often consulted Quranic verses, legal precedents, poetry, and the wisdom of elders. Some rulings were remembered for generations, inspiring scholars and storytellers alike. Others were remembered only because they were so strange. And woven through all these cases was politics, a quiet, constant presence. Judges tried to be impartial, but powerful tribes, wealthy patrons, and ambitious officials often influenced proceedings. A judge might reduce a punishment to keep peace between clans, or deliver a harsh verdict to prevent a dangerous precedent. Justice balanced on a tightrope of fairness and diplomacy, and the best qadis were not only wise, but nimble. Yet beneath everything, beneath the legal creativity, the odd punishments, the philosophical debates, lay a simple truth. Laws reflected the values of society. They revealed what people cared about, what angered them, what frightened them, and what made them laugh. And from these laws emerged expectations, unwritten rules of behavior, gestures of respect, customs of daily life that ensured harmony without the need for a judge's intervention. People knew how to greet elders, how to treat guests, how to behave in public spaces, and how to navigate the complex etiquette of a world where honor meant everything. So, let us step away from the judgment hall, leaving behind roosters on trial, and men riding donkeys backwards, and move into the quiet realm of social manners, those subtle, powerful rules that guided every interaction. Chapter 12 awaits. Stepping away from the Qadi's shaded courtyard and the clamor of peculiar lawsuits, we enter a subtler landscape, one with rules just as binding as any written law. These were the unspoken expectations, the quiet customs, the delicate choreography that shaped how people moved through the Umayyad world. In some ways, the etiquette of daily life governed behavior more tightly than judges ever could. One misstep could spark irritation, tribal tension, or even a small scandal whispered across markets for days. Greetings, for example, were carefully performed rituals. A simple "peace be upon you" carried weight. Tone, timing, and sincerity mattered. Returning the greeting too softly could be interpreted as indifference. Returning it too loudly risked seeming boastful. Some greeted elders with lowered gazes, others with a hand over the heart, and still others with a gentle touch on the shoulder. The wrong choice could send a message you didn't intend, messages that people, in their endless fascination with social nuance, would dissect for hours afterward. Hospitality was not just expected, it was sacred. To turn someone away from your door, friend, traveler, or stranger, risked immense shame. Guests were offered water before conversation, food before questions, and comfort before any talk of business. Even someone you disliked had to be welcomed with politeness so smooth it nearly counted as performance art. Families developed reputations based on their hospitality, and such reputations clung for generations. And yet, hospitality had its secret challenges. A guest who overstayed could drain a household's resources. A talkative visitor could derail an entire afternoon's chores. But no matter how inconvenient the visit, hosts smiled, served dates, and insisted repeatedly that their guest eat more. Declining second or third helpings politely was an art in itself. Sometimes it required dramatic phrases like, "By God, if I eat any more, I will remain full for 3 days," just to convince a host to stop feeding you. Conversation followed its own unwritten code. Complimenting someone too directly could be misinterpreted as flattery with hidden motives. Criticizing someone publicly, even gently, risked stirring tribal pride. People learned to speak indirectly, weaving delicate hints into stories or parables. A father might scold his son by telling a tale about a foolish boy in a village far away, knowing the message would land perfectly. A friend might warn another of a bad decision by quoting poetry instead of giving blunt advice. Public behavior was equally coded. Walking too quickly suggested poor manners. Walking too slowly suggested laziness. Sitting with your feet pointed towards someone older was almost unthinkable. And interrupting a conversation between elders, unless the house was on fire, was a guaranteed way to shame yourself for weeks. Women navigated their own spheres of etiquette. They exchanged visits at specific times of day, brought small gifts when entering another home, and shared news in ways that were both gentle and deeply insightful. Their conversations carried layers of meaning, where a single raised eyebrow could communicate more than a full sentence. Children were expected to follow an entire lexicon of manners, speaking softly, waiting for adults to finish talking, offering seats to elders, and learning the subtle art of reading the room. A child who greeted guests confidently earned praise. One who hid behind a parent's robe earned affectionate teasing that still carried a hint of expectation. Breaking these rules could have surprising consequences. A man who failed to return a greeting might find neighbors whispering that he had become proud. Someone who didn't treat a guest well could damage their family's honor. A clumsy comment or poorly timed joke might spiral into a 3-day argument between clans. Even the decision to sit or stand at a gathering could communicate more than words. And yet, beneath all this complexity, people found comfort in the structure. These customs created predictable rhythms, smoothing interactions like oil softens leather. They made life feel ordered and meaningful, even when messy. But etiquette did more than govern ordinary behavior. It laid the foundation for one of the most essential parts of Umayyad life, the art of hosting. For if greetings, gestures, and manners were delicate tools, hospitality was the grand stage upon which they were all displayed. So now, let us follow these unwritten rules into the intimate, bustling, sometimes chaotic world of receiving guests, where generosity met chaos, and where every household learned to balance honor with survival. Chapter 13 awaits. From the delicate rules of social etiquette, we step naturally into the grandest stage of all those customs, the home filled with guests. In the Umayyad world, hospitality was not a pleasant option or a polite gesture. It was an obligation woven so tightly into the fabric of society that refusing a guest was almost unthinkable. To host was to honor your lineage. To feed a traveler was to uphold a tradition older than cities. And to shelter a stranger was to guard your own reputation as fiercely as you guarded your home. But noble obligations often led to some very entertaining chaos. Imagine a knock at the door just after sunrise. A dusty traveler stands on the threshold, his sandals worn, his water skin empty. Before he can speak, you have already ushered him inside, offered him a seat, poured water into his hands for washing, and prepared dates and bread on a tray. Only after he has eaten, preferably 2 or 3 helpings, may you ask his name or purpose. Even then, you must do so gently, so he does not feel hurried or scrutinized. Hosts took pride in this. The better the welcome, the finer the reputation. Some families were known for serving large meals. Others gained fame for their warm conversation or soft bedding. But no matter how generous, every home had stories of guests who tested these noble virtues. There was the traveler who claimed he needed 1 night only and stayed 12. The poet who recited verses nonstop, hoping his hosts would admire his never-ending river of brilliance. The cousin who appeared unannounced each spring and proceeded to eat as if each meal were his last. And of course, the quiet stranger who slept so deeply that the entire household tiptoed around him for hours, afraid to disturb what must surely have been the most peaceful man in the empire. But hosts rarely complained openly. To do so risked offending God, guests, or, perhaps most dangerously, neighborhood gossip. Instead, they smiled, refilled cups, reheated leftover stews, and whispered prayers for patience. At night, when the guest finally slept, the family might gather in the courtyard and exchange looks that said everything. Is he staying tomorrow too? Still, They prepared for another day. Feeding guests was a ritual in itself. Trays of rice and lamb, honeyed pastries, bread still steaming from the oven. A proper host apologized constantly for not serving more, even when the table was overflowing. Guests politely insisted they could not possibly eat another bite, then happily accepted when the host gently pushed the plate closer. It was a dance, full of phrases repeated so often they became one of the empire's shared songs. Eat, please. I have already eaten. Just one more bite? By God, I'm full. Then eat for blessing. Fine, one more bite. And after food came stories, news of distant towns, tales of tribal drama, accounts of strange markets, odd travelers, or unusual weather. Guests were windows into the rest of the world. Families listened, wide-eyed, learning about lands they might never see. Children especially clung to every word, imagining mountains taller than any they knew, seas wider than their dreams, and villages where people dressed, ate, or spoke in strange and marvelous ways. Sometimes, travelers brought small gifts: a jar of honey from a far-off valley, a piece of cloth dyed in a rare color, a little charm carved from bone. These tokens lived on shelves for years, cherished reminders of visits both chaotic and dear. And when guests finally departed, hours, days, or weeks later, they left behind stories for the hosts to tell, warmth for the home, and occasionally a few missing spoons. Yet this sacred hospitality was not limited to houses. It extended into the desert, the caravan routes, and the lonely outposts between cities. The same generosity awaited travelers at ribats, tent camps, and caravanserais, where strangers gathered like temporary families. On the long roads between cities, hospitality became a matter of survival. Warmth in a cold night, a sip of water in a dry land, a meal shared by necessity rather than courtesy. And so, as we leave the busy warmth of the Umayyad household and step into the open air, the sounds of hooves and the calls of camel drivers float toward us. Goods, stories, and people begin their long movements across sand and stone. Let us follow them now into the vast networks that connected the empire, the world of caravans, camels, and the endless road. Chapter 14 awaits. Leaving behind the warm clatter of household hospitality, we step into the open expanse where hospitality takes on an entirely different meaning. Out here, on the long roads between cities, generosity can mean survival, and a shared sip of water can be worth more than gold. The Umayyad Empire was vast, stretching from the Atlantic shores of Al-Andalus to the edges of India, and stitching this world together were the caravans, long winding chains of camels, merchants, guards, and wanderers who carried the lifeblood of commerce across deserts, plains, and mountains. The day begins before sunrise. A faint silver light glimmers along the horizon as the caravan leader, usually distinguishable by his booming voice and a turban wrapped with enviable precision, calls everyone awake. Camels grunt their displeasure as loads are strapped onto their backs. The animals kneel reluctantly, their long-lashed eyes half closed in sleepy contempt. Every caravan has at least one camel whose personality becomes infamous for years. The kind that complains loudly at every step, spits on the command to rise, and somehow finds a way to bite the same unlucky traveler every day. Travelers shuffle about, rubbing sleep from their eyes, stuffing dates into their mouths, and checking their water skins. The desert is a patient teacher, and its first lesson is simple. Water is everything. Every morning begins with calculations. How much to drink? How much to save? How much the next well might yield? Some wells are generous, others trickle miserly streams, and some, despite stories of eternal flow, turn out to be entirely imaginary. When the caravan finally moves, it does so with a rhythm both awkward and strangely graceful. Camels sway like ships on a slow sea, their feet gliding over sand with surprising quiet. Merchants murmur prayers. A few sing to keep their spirits up. A child traveling with his father counts dunes, only to lose track after 20 and start over. The desert sun climbs, steady and merciless. Travel was slow, painfully slow by modern standards. A good day meant 30 or 40 kilometers. A bad day meant 10. Sometimes the winds blew hard enough to erase tracks behind them, making the caravan feel like it wandered through an endless dream. Sometimes a sandstorm swept in, forcing everyone to huddle beneath cloaks, while camels folded their legs and endured with stoic resignation. Yet despite the difficulties, life on the road held its own rituals. At midday, the caravan paused for a meal. People sat in small clusters, sharing dried figs, nuts, and flatbread, warmed on a metal pan held over a tiny fire. Someone always managed to brew tea or a bitter herbal drink, though tea itself would not become common until centuries later. Conversations drifted across the camp. Stories of home, jokes about misbehaving animals, news from distant cities. Even strangers became companions after a week on the same road. As the day cooled, the caravan approached ribbit outposts, fortified inns or small garrison stations that offered shelter. These outposts were lifelines, places with wells, shade, and a momentary sense of safety. The walls were often simple, built of mud brick or stone, but they felt like palaces after the desert heat. Travelers traded stories with soldiers stationed there, exchanged news, and sometimes received a meal of lentils or barley bread. Night on the road held its own beauty. Campfires flickered across the dunes like scattered stars. Camels settled into the sand with soft sighs. Guards walked slow circles around the camp, watching for thieves or predators. Someone recited poetry. Someone else tuned a small string instrument. The desert, which had seemed so harsh under the sun, softened into something gentle, vast, cool, and filled with quiet wonder. Still, danger never fully disappeared. Caravans relied heavily on tribal alliances to pass safely through certain regions. Crossing land without permission could lead to conflict, raids, or tense negotiations. Tribal politics shaped the roads as much as geography. A caravan's safe passage often depended on a network of agreements, favors, and old stories of loyalty. And so, as the fire dies down and the caravan drifts into uneasy sleep beneath a sky crowded with stars, we turn our attention toward those tribes, toward the alliances, rivalries, and unexpected friendships that governed so much of the desert world. For to understand the movement of caravans, we must understand the people who ruled the sand. Chapter 15 awaits. As the caravan sleeps beneath its blanket of stars, we drift from the lonely desert roads into the invisible forces that shaped them. For every safe passage, every protected well, every night spent without fear, there was a web of tribal politics humming quietly in the background. The Umayyad Empire may have boasted palaces, governors, and vast administrative systems, but beneath all that structure beat the ancient pulse of tribal loyalty. Complex, proud, easily offended, and profoundly influential. To understand the era, you must imagine tribes not as small wandering families, but as enormous networks of lineage, marriage ties, poetry, and reputation. A single tribe might stretch across hundreds of miles, its members recognizing distant cousins they had never met simply through the way they spoke or the way they wrapped a turban. These bonds were strong enough to start wars or end them with a single handshake. At the heart of this tribal world was something surprisingly poetic: honor. And honor was expressed not only through deeds, but through words. Poets were not entertainers, they were weapons. A skilled poet could elevate a tribe into legend or plunge it into humiliation with a single verse. Some battles were fought entirely in poetry, long before any camel mounted or any sword glinted in the sun. One poet would boast of his tribe's bravery, another would mock their rations, their camels, or, most dangerously, their ancestors. Crowds gathered to listen, hearts pounding, for the right insult could ignite a feud that lasted generations. And yet, just as easily, tribes forged alliances that astonished outsiders. A fierce rivalry between two clans could evaporate overnight if a marriage linked them or if a shared enemy appeared on the horizon. Pride guided everything, but so did necessity. The desert was unforgiving, and alliances were the lifeblood of survival. Sometimes, alliances formed in moments so small they became stories retold for years. A man offering water to a stranger at a well could unknowingly assist a rival, clansman, and through that simple kindness, spark negotiations that healed old wounds. A shared meal, a rescued traveler, or a poetic tribute offered at the right moment could shift entire political landscapes. The Umayyad rulers understood this well. Behind the stone walls of Damascus, caliphs and governors navigated these tribal currents with delicate precision. Appointments to leadership roles often balanced tribal interests, like weights on a scale, ensuring no single group felt slighted or neglected. A governor from one tribe might be compensated with a powerful military commander from another. A provincial office might pass from one clan to its traditional rival to keep the peace. Of course, it didn't always work smoothly. Betrayals were common, often sudden, sometimes dramatic. A tribe promised support in the morning and withdrew it in the evening if a better offer came along. A proud leader, offended by a minor slight, perhaps an insufficiently warm greeting, might pull his people from a military campaign. And poets, as always, were ready to turn these political twists into verses recited across markets and campfires. Still, amid the rivalry and drama, the desert fostered unexpected friendships. A Bedouin leader might find himself laughing with a man from a distant tribe over shared experiences. the stubbornness of camels, the unpredictability of rain, the beauty of a particular valley at dusk. Stories of such friendships became cherished reminders that politics, however turbulent, could still bend toward humanity. And as tribal politics shaped the vast spaces between cities, they also influenced the empire's capital, Damascus. The court had to navigate shifting alliances with precision, offering gifts, hosting dignitaries, and weaving promises with silk-soft words. Palace life, though lavish, was never free from the undercurrents of tribal dynamics. One wrong decision could spark unrest in the provinces. One clever move could win loyalty for a generation. So as we leave the open desert and its ever-shifting alliances, we approach the heart of Umayyad power, a world of marble halls, scented gardens, and quiet intrigues. The desert's politics do not disappear there. They merely slip into silk robes and whisper through corridors instead of across dunes. Let us step now into that world where luxury met strategy and where the hum of tribal pride echoed softly beneath the songs of fountains. Chapter 16 awaits. From the windswept dunes of tribal politics, we cross an invisible threshold and step into a world that feels almost unreal. Here, the desert's harshness dissolves into marble, mosaic, and the soft hum of courtly life. The Umayyad palaces, especially those of Damascus, were not merely buildings. They were statements, symbols, carefully crafted stages upon which power, elegance, and subtle intrigue played out day after day. Imagine approaching the palace gates at dawn. The first rays of the sun catch the walls, turning limestone gold. Guards stand tall in embroidered sashes, their spears gleaming as they watch every face that passes. A scribe hurries by, clutching scrolls. A servant carries trays of sweet pastries toward the kitchens. The palace is waking, not with the gentle rhythms of a household, but with the structured precision of a living institution. Inside, the halls stretch wide and cool. Geometric patterns bloom across the floors, intricate mosaics in blues and reds that shimmer like still water. The walls are smooth plaster, painted with vines, pomegranates, and birds frozen mid-flight. Everywhere you walk, you hear running water, fountains bubbling in courtyards, streams channeled along stone grooves, aqueducts sighing softly behind the walls. Water was not just decoration, it was power, a luxury displayed with deliberate grace in a land where most people cherished every drop. Gardens filled courtyards with life. Palm trees rustled gently in the breeze. Rose bushes grew in neat rows, their scent mingling with jasmine and citrus blossoms. Pomegranate trees cast dappled shade over stone benches where poets sometimes sat composing verses for the caliph, or for whichever courtier requested a flattering line to soothe a political disagreement. Birds hopped across the tiles, bold enough to steal crumbs left from outdoor feasts. The people who lived and worked here formed a small universe of their own. Scribes moved like streams of ink through the hallways, each one responsible for recording decrees, correspondence, and sometimes even gossip, disguised as intelligence reports. Their reed pens whispered across parchment from dawn until long after sunset. Palace guards, selected as much for loyalty as for strength, lined corridors and courtyards. They observed everything yet spoke little, their silence a reminder that power does not always need words. Servants drifted softly from room to room. Nurses, cleaners, cooks, bath attendants, gardeners, and messengers. They knew every corner of the palace, every routine, every temper. Their quiet competence kept the vast machine of court life moving, even when politics made the air heavy. And then there were the poets, always hovering near someone important. Their talents were prized, sometimes feared. A well-crafted verse could immortalize a caliph's virtue or expose a minister's folly. Patrons competed to host such poets, hoping their words would polish reputations or soften rivalries. Many a political tension was eased over wine or syrup drinks, as a poet recited something soothing, humorous, or beautifully distracting. The caliph's private quarters were quieter than the grand audience halls. Even there, the air smelled of incense and polished wood. Soft carpets muffled footsteps. Advisors came and went with respectful bows, carrying reports from distant provinces, complaints from governors, or news of tribal disputes. The caliph listened, asked questions, and weighed decisions that would ripple across lands as varied as forests of Anatolia, plains of Iraq, and coasts of North Africa. But the palace was not all ceremony and power. Between the formalities existed small, intimate moments. A servant coaxing a bird away from a platter. Two scribes whispering about a new decree that would surely anger someone important. A gardener proudly showing a rare rose to anyone who would look. A young guard trying not to appear nervous as he took his first shift outside the caliph's chamber. Life at court was a tapestry woven from luxury and pressure, beauty and politics. Every hall echoed with history in the making. Every servant's step, every poet's verse, every whispered conversation carried more meaning than appeared at first glance. And yet, beneath all the splendor, the palace depended on something surprisingly simple: routine, daily work. People rising each morning to perform tasks that kept the empire functioning. Ledgers to write, petitions to hear, meals to prepare, guards to rotate, gardens to tend. So now, with one last look at the shimmering mosaics and fragrant courtyards, let us walk out of the palace interior and follow the people who kept this world alive. The sun is rising higher and the day's work is beginning. Chapter 17 awaits. Stepping out of the palace gates and into the bustling heart of the city, we meet the true engine of the Umayyad world. Not the caliphs in their shimmering halls, but the workers who filled the streets with motion, noise, and purpose. The sun has risen fully now, casting warmth over Damascus, Kufa, Cordoba, and every city across the empire. As shops open and courtyards come alive, we are greeted by a dizzying variety of professions, some essential, some peculiar, all woven into the daily rhythm of life. Candle makers were among the earliest to begin work. Their day started in the dim light before dawn, stirring vats of melted tallow or dripping wax layer by layer over rows of wicks hung on wooden frames. The smell was strong, sometimes unpleasant, but their craft lit the nights of every home, mosque, and market stall. Skilled candle makers could produce thin, elegant tapers or thick ceremonial candles carved with geometric patterns. Others specialized in scented ones, infused with rose, musk, or sandalwood to mask the natural odor. Water carriers, meanwhile, were the city's lifeline. You could hear them before you saw them. Leather sloshing, wooden ladles clacking, and voices calling out offers of fresh water from the river or well. They moved with surprising strength, carrying enormous goatskin sacks across shoulders hardened by years of labor. Some delivered water to wealthy homes, while others wandered the streets offering passers-by a drink for a copper coin. In cities with aqueducts, they supplemented the system. In smaller towns, they were the system. Then there were the falcon trainers, an entire world unto themselves. These specialists, often from desert tribes, trained birds of prey with a mix of patience, ritual, and instinctive understanding. A trained falcon was a symbol of prestige, a hunting tool, and occasionally a diplomatic gift. Trainers spoke to their birds in soft, rhythmic patterns, taught them to recognize commands, and tended to them with a seriousness more often reserved for royalty. Watching a falcon dive from the sky with precise, lethal grace was as much art as sport. Perfume sellers brought their own magic to the markets. Their stalls were small, but the scents that drifted from them were unmistakable. Ambergris, rosewater, frankincense, patchouli, jasmine, oud. Tiny glass bottles reflected the sun like scattered jewels. Customers approached shyly, sniffing corks, rubbing droplets onto their wrists, debating which fragrance best suited important events. Some perfumes were meant to soothe, others to attract. A few were purchased in hopes of impressing someone at Friday prayer. And scribes, the scribes, complained more loudly than any worker in the empire. Their fingers cramped. Their ink dried too quickly. The reeds never cut quite right. The parchment often flawed. And the officials they served demanded endless copies of everything. Yet without them, nothing moved. Not taxes, not trade agreements, not court rulings. A city could survive without poets, but not without scribes. They knew their worth, and their dramatic sighs could often be heard drifting through open windows. Mixed among these professions were dozens more. Metal workers hammered horseshoes and elegant lamps. Glass blowers shaped delicate cups from glowing orbs of molten sand. Bakers pulled fresh bread from clay ovens, the scent luring people from blocks away. Tailors stitched robes in tiny workshops crammed with fabric. Soap sellers hawked olive oil bars infused with herbs. Street entertainers performed tricks, recited poetry, or played instruments for coins and smiles. Some jobs were strange, even by medieval standards. There were professional wakers who banged drums at dawn during Ramadan to rouse sleeping neighborhoods. There were pigeon keepers who trained flocks to deliver messages. Herbalists sold powders that promised everything from better sleep to increased bravery. And in corners of the market, bone carvers fashioned amulets claimed to ward off illness or envy. Each profession added a thread to the city's tapestry. Each worker kept the rhythm of daily life steady. And while skills varied, one thing was shared. Knowledge passed from hand to hand, master to apprentice, parent to child. Understanding a craft meant inheriting a tradition. This flow of knowledge, slow, careful, vital, leads us naturally into the next chapter. For behind every skilled hand was a teacher, a school, or a wandering scholar who had once opened the world to eager minds. Now, Let us follow the path from the workplace to the classroom, from craft to curiosity, from routine to learning. Chapter 18 awaits. From the noise of workshops and markets, we drift toward a quieter, more deliberate rhythm, the sound of learning. Across the Umayyad Empire, education unfolded not only in schools, but in mosques, private homes, courtyards, and shaded porticos where students gathered in circles around beloved teachers. Knowledge was not confined to buildings. It lived in voices, gestures, recitations, and the soft tapping of wooden pens against inkpots. The most common classroom was, of course, the mosque. At dawn, after prayer, groups of children and young adults settled cross-legged on reed mats, while a teacher recited passages from the Quran in a steady, melodic tone. Students repeated the verses in unison, their voices rising and falling like gentle waves. Memorization was central. Entire generations grew up carrying sacred text in their hearts, long before they learned to write it on parchment. Child's first triumph often came the day he or she recited a long passage flawlessly, earning smiles, dates, and sometimes a tiny celebratory gift. But education extended far beyond memorization. Older students studied grammar because language was considered a precious architecture that revealed the world's hidden order. A misplaced vowel could change a meaning. One incorrect inflection could ignite debate among scholars for hours. Lessons in grammar, far from dry, were sometimes passionate affairs. Elders argued over points of syntax with the seriousness of warriors discussing strategy. Some debates lasted days, fueled by tea, cold water, or sheer stubbornness. Alongside grammar came poetry. In open-air courtyards, students listened as teachers recited lines by ancient Arab poets, tales of bravery, longing, wisdom, and humor. Young listeners tried to mimic the rhythm, hoping someday to compose verses of their own. Poetry sharpened memory, shaped eloquence, and strengthened cultural identity. A well-educated person was expected to quote at least a few lines at the right moment, like seasoning sprinkled over conversation. Philosophy and theology lived in another set of spaces, the shaded colonnades where scholars paced slowly, debating free will, ethics, logic, and the nature of the universe. These sessions drew all kinds of listeners, tailors taking a break, merchants resting their legs, travelers curious about local ideas. Anyone could pause and listen, even participate if brave enough. It was a world where a man of humble origin could challenge a respected scholar if his argument was sharp enough, and sometimes win. Private tutoring flourished as well. Wealthier families hired teachers to instruct their children at home in reading, math, history, and sometimes foreign languages. A girl might learn calligraphy from a patient aunt. A boy might learn arithmetic from his father as they counted ledgers together. Education was a family effort as much as a public one. There were even traveling students, young men who journeyed from city to city seeking the most renowned scholars. They slept in mosques, worked odd jobs to fund their journeys, and carried notebooks filled with teachings gathered across the empire. When they returned home, they brought back not just knowledge, but stories of Andalusian gardens, Egyptian libraries, Iraqi philosophers, and North African jurists whose lectures drew crowds big enough to fill streets. Across all these learning environments, one thing bound them together: an eagerness for understanding. Whether a child sounding out letters for the first time, or a gray-bearded scholar quoting Aristotle in Arabic, each carried the belief that learning was both worship and wonder, a way to sharpen the mind and soften the heart. But even the most dedicated student needed rest. Learning shaped the daylight hours, but leisure shaped the evenings. And the Umayyads, for all their discipline and devotion, loved to unwind in ways both simple and surprisingly strange. So now, let us step out of the school circle, shake ink from our fingertips, and follow the students as they drift into the warm glow of afternoon, a time for games, music, gardens, and amusements. Chapter 19 awaits. Leaving the quiet hum of learning behind, we slip into the livelier hours of the afternoon and evening. Hours where the mind relaxed, friends gathered, and the Umayyad world revealed its playful side. For all their devotion to learning and ritual, people of the era delighted in games, jokes, competitions, and performances that blended intellect with mischief. Leisure, in its many forms, was a mirror of the society itself. Clever, communal, and occasionally a little absurd. Chess was the reigning champion of respectable entertainment. Introduced from Persia, not long before the Umayyads rose to power, it spread through cities like a spark through dry grass. Courtyards, mosques after prayer, market corners, and palace gardens all hosted intense matches. Two players leaned over wooden boards carved with simple or elaborate pieces. Kings, elephants, chariots, each move made with the gravity of a political decision. Spectators loved to mutter commentary under their breath, pretending not to take sides while absolutely taking sides. A sharp player gained admiration. A brilliant one became a local legend. But chess was only one form of mental combat. Poetry duels were just as popular and far more theatrical. Two poets squared off in a circle of eager listeners, slinging verses at each other like verbal arrows. One offered a line praising his tribe's courage. The other countered with a couplet mocking his opponent's camel. The crowd gasped, laughed, clapped, or winced depending on the sharpness of the metaphor. Sometimes these duels resolved arguments. Sometimes they caused them. Either way, they were unforgettable. Storytellers filled the nights with magic. As the heat of the day faded, people gathered around a lantern or fire to hear tales of ancient heroes, wandering spirits, clever tricksters, and faraway kingdoms. Some storytellers embellished wildly, adding monsters to historical events, or inserting themselves into famous battles. Nobody minded. Half the pleasure was spotting the exaggeration and whispering to your neighbor, "He just made that up." Children leaned forward with wide eyes. Elders nodded knowingly. Travelers felt at home for a moment. Performances involving trained animals added a more mischievous flavor to public leisure. Monkeys danced to drum beats, goats balanced on planks, and falcons showed off their precision. Some performers claimed their animals could predict the future. A monkey choosing between two dates supposedly revealed whether it would rain the next day. A parrot picking a colored pebble might signal good fortune. Most people knew it was nonsense, but believing added fun to the show. And then there were the odd competitions, little slices of human silliness preserved in dusty chronicles. foot races in narrow alleys where half the runners tripped over their robes, palm date pit spitting contests with rules that became more complicated every year, guess the spice challenges where blindfolded contestants sniffed handfuls of ground herbs and tried not to sneeze, even mock debates in which two participants passionately argued positions neither of them believed, simply to entertain onlookers. Music wove through nearly every form of relaxation. Flutes, drums, lutes, and frame drums accompanied gatherings in homes and gardens. People sang old tribal songs, devotional melodies, or playful tunes invented on the spot. Some groups preferred quiet listening. Others preferred clapping, swaying, or dancing until the moon climbed high. Musicians were welcomed everywhere, from elite banquets to simple rooftop gatherings. Not all hobbies were public. Some people preferred peaceful solitude, tending rooftop gardens, crafting intricate calligraphy, carving small wooden trinkets, or studying the stars from a cool courtyard at night. Amateur astronomers sketched constellations, named stars, and speculated about celestial patterns long before astronomy became a formal science. Children, of course, brought their own joyful chaos. They played marbles with polished seeds, built tiny sand forts, chased each other through alleys, and invented songs that adults pretended to dislike, but secretly found charming. Their laughter softened even the busiest afternoons. Altogether, the games and hobbies of the Umayyad world created a vibrant landscape of joy and creativity. They bonded neighbors, soothed tired minds, and filled evenings with color. Leisure was not an escape from life. It was a celebration of it. And celebrations, in all their splendor and noise and emotion, were an even bigger part of the culture. Festivals lit up entire cities, marked seasons, honored victories, and brought together people who otherwise lived in very different worlds. So now, as the music fades and the storytellers close their tales for the night, let us drift toward the grand gatherings, feasts, festivals, and holy days where the entire empire seemed to breathe in unison. Chapter 20 awaits. As the everyday amusements fade into twilight, we step into occasions when joy rose far above ordinary leisure. Moments when the Umayyad Empire came alive in bursts of color, sound, scent, and sheer human warmth. Festivals and celebrations were the stitches that bound communities together. Expressions of faith, family, and tradition that carried a rhythm unmistakably their own. Loud, heartfelt, and sometimes delightfully chaotic, they reminded people that life was not only duty and discipline, but also celebration and shared delight. Eid mornings were among the brightest days of the year. Before sunrise, the city hummed with anticipation. Families donned freshly washed clothes, often simple, sometimes elaborately dyed. Perfumes scented the air. Children tugged at sleeves, barely able to contain their excitement. People walked together toward open fields or large courtyards for the communal prayer. A sight that turned the rising sun into a golden backdrop for thousands of bowed heads. After the prayer, everything burst open. Markets swelled, families exchanged warm embraces, children clutched new toys, and homes filled with dishes prepared only on special days. Dates stuffed with almonds, honey cakes, spiced lamb, and fresh breads piled on trays until tables groaned. Door after door opened to neighbors offering sweets or small gifts. Even those who had quarreled earlier in the year often chose Eid as the day to forgive and start anew. Weddings carried their own kind of magic, lavish, theatrical, joyful, and sometimes hilariously unpredictable. A wedding could last a day, or 3, or even a full week if the families were determined enough. Processions wound through the streets with drums, flutes, cheering relatives, and children dancing wildly at the edges. Women decorated their hands with henna in swirling patterns, and the bride's gown gleamed with embroidery that might have taken months to complete. At the wedding feast, guests argued cheerfully over which dish was best. Poets composed improvised verses comparing the bride's beauty to the moon or the groom's courage to a mountain lion. A mischievous uncle might hide the groom's sandals, insisting on a playful ransom. Children darted between tables, stealing extra sweets. After the meal came music, loud, rhythmic, often irresistible, until the crowd swayed, clapped, and sang arm in arm. Yet for all the dancing and laughter, weddings were also steeped in ritual. Blessings were recited softly by elders. Gifts were exchanged with symbolic care. Certain foods were served for good fortune, others avoided for reasons half religious, half superstitious. A spilled cup might be interpreted as a sign, hopefully good, occasionally debated. The blending of solemnity and celebration made each wedding feel both ancient and immediate. Beyond these major events lay dozens of smaller festivals, seasonal celebrations, tribal gatherings, harvest feasts, and commemorations of local saints or heroes. Some villages honored the first rain of the year with songs that echoed through valleys. Others held springtime fairs with juggling acts, herbal booths, and long lines of animals decorated in ribbons. Certain regions celebrated uniquely odd customs, such as mock battles fought with dyed flour or competitions to see who could recite the most poetry without stumbling. And across the whole empire, from Andalus to Khorasan, food was the centerpiece of every celebration. It wasn't just nourishment, it was memory, love, pride, and tradition served on a platter. Sharing food meant sharing blessing. Accepting a dish meant accepting goodwill. Even disagreements melted when trays of sweet pastries arrived on the scene. Few feuds could survive the diplomatic power of honey and butter. Yet amid all this festive joy, the Umayyad world remained deeply spiritual. Celebrations, no matter how boisterous, were shaded with reminders of humility, gratitude, and connection to the divine. People might dance until midnight, but they still gathered for prayer at dawn. A wedding feast might be exuberant, but the marriage contract was signed with solemn intention. Joy and reverence intertwined like vines on a garden wall. And it is precisely this balance, the blend of celebration and devotion, that leads us into a quieter space. For beyond the noise of festivals lay a world defined not by feasting, but by faith, not by drums and laughter, but by reflection and guidance. So now, as the music fades and the lanterns grow dim, let us step gently into the heart of spiritual life, where scholars, imams, mystics, and ordinary believers shaped their world through devotion and contemplation. Chapter 21 awaits. As the echoes of wedding drums fade and the last plates of Eid sweets are cleared away, we step into a quieter world, one shaped by voices of guidance, devotion, interpretation, and sometimes surprisingly heated disagreement. The Umayyad Empire was not only a political and cultural force, it was a vast landscape of spiritual inquiry, where imams, jurists, preachers, and mystics all carved out their own spheres of influence. Some worked in harmony, others, well, they enjoyed a good debate almost as much as scholars enjoyed grammar. In every city, the imam was a familiar presence, calm-voiced, steady-paced, often someone whose recitation of Quran could soften a hardened heart. These imams led daily prayers, taught lessons, visited the sick, and mediated household conflicts. People approached them with questions about everything from inheritance laws to dreams, dietary concerns, and family arguments. An imam often became part spiritual guide, part counselor, part community elder, all without ever asking for the role. Hovering within the same orbit, but carrying different authority, were the jurists, the fiqh scholars. These men, and occasionally women in advisory roles behind the scenes, were the interpreters of law, the decoders of scripture, the guardians of precedent. Where imams offered comfort, jurists offered precision. They loved nuance, built arguments like architects built arches, and could quote multiple opinions on a single issue without blinking. Sometimes their passion for fine distinctions led to amusing outcomes, such as extended debates over whether a particular act was discouraged but not forbidden, forbidden but not punishable, or neutral but mildly suspicious. And then there were the preachers, fiery, poetic, sometimes a little theatrical. On Fridays, they climbed the minbar with the confidence of seasoned performers. Their sermons ranged from deeply moving reminders of compassion to blistering admonitions against greed, gossip, or political corruption. Some were so eloquent that people repeated their metaphors for weeks. Others were so long-winded that children fidgeted, adults sighed, and even the mosque's pigeons looked bored. But perhaps the most intriguing figures were the mystics, the early seekers of spiritual depth, who preferred night prayers to public debates. They gathered in small groups or lived as wandering ascetics, reciting verses by moonlight, reflecting on the nature of the soul, and sometimes offering insights that hovered between profound and puzzling. A mystic might weep at the beauty of a verse, then laugh at the foolishness of worldly concerns. People respected them, admired them, and occasionally whispered that they might be a little strange, but in an endearing, holy sort of way. With so many voices shaping religious life, disagreements were inevitable. Scholars debated theology in mosques until the inkpots ran dry. Jurists corrected preachers for exaggerations. Preachers scolded jurists for splitting hairs. Mystics shook their heads at all the noise and urged everyone to focus on sincerity. And ordinary believers, caught between these perspectives, sometimes responded with good-natured humor, choosing the opinion that seemed most reasonable, most practical, or most likely to ease a household dispute. Amid this lively, spiritual landscape existed a number of beliefs that, while earnest, were undeniably quirky. Some people believed that reciting certain verses before traveling protected them from camel accidents. Others insisted that saying a short prayer before drinking water ensured the sip would bring wisdom. A few thought that sleeping on the right side guaranteed more truthful dreams, and many believed that a person's character could be revealed through the way they performed wudu. Fast and careless meant impatience. Slow and thorough meant sincerity. Excessively long meant the person probably had something else on their mind. Despite these quirks, the heart of religious life remained sincere. People sought closeness to God with genuine hunger through charity, prayer, reflection, and community. Friday prayers filled streets with unity. Night prayers filled homes with quiet. Quranic recitation drifted from courtyards, blending with the evening breeze. It was a world of devotion, shaped not only by scholars and preachers, but by shopkeepers, shepherds, mothers, soldiers, and children who memorized verses until the words felt like family. Yet for all this sincerity, the Umayyad world also held a rich undercurrent of superstition, beliefs that coexisted with faith, sometimes reinforcing it, sometimes contradicting it, always adding texture to daily life. These beliefs crept into dreams, chores, weddings, illnesses, and travel plans. And so, from the dignified halls of scholarship and the passionate voices of preachers, we drift into that softer, stranger realm where faith and folklore intertwine. Chapter 22 awaits. Leaving behind the scholars with their ink-stained fingers and the preachers whose voices echoed through crowded mosques, we slip quietly into a softer, more shadowy layer of the Umayyad world, one ruled not by law or theology, but by whispers, symbols, and the unseen. For all their devotion and learning, people across the empire carried within them a deep respect for the mysterious. Superstitions wove through daily life like thread in a tapestry, ancient and enduring. It began with the jinn. Stories of these invisible beings drifted through markets, households, desert camps, and palace corridors alike. Children whispered about them before bed. Adults swore they had encountered strange lights or inexplicable breezes that surely signaled a jinn's presence. Some people avoided pouring hot water outside at night, fearing it might strike a hidden being. Others refrained from whistling after sunset, convinced it invited unwanted attention from the unseen. Dreams held tremendous weight as well. A pleasant dream of clear water, green fields, or a smiling stranger was often interpreted as a sign of blessing. But a bad dream, one involving snakes, collapsing buildings, or a loud voice with no source, could unsettle a person for days. Many hurried to recite certain prayers upon waking, hoping to chase away any lingering misfortune. Some even refused to tell their closest friend a disturbing dream, believing that speaking it aloud might give it power. Animals, too, delivered messages. A black crow circling overhead might signal an unwelcome visitor. A desert fox crossing your path at dawn could mean luck or mischief, depending on who interpreted it. If a lizard appeared near a doorstep, elders debated whether it was simply seeking warmth or warning the household of something unseen. Even the behavior of camels sparked speculation. A herd suddenly turning west without reason was sometimes considered an omen that travelers should stay home. Eclipses were especially frightening. As the sun dimmed or the moon vanished into shadow, people gathered in prayer, reciting verses with trembling voices. Some believed eclipses were signs of divine displeasure. Others thought they signaled major events on the horizon: wars, famines, or the rise and fall of leaders. Even those who understood the celestial mechanics felt a chill when daylight thinned unnaturally, as though the world itself were holding its breath. Desert signs carried their own warnings: a sudden, eerie stillness before a sandstorm, unusual patterns in the wind, strange markings in the sand that might be footprints or something else. Travelers paid close attention to these clues out of both practical caution and superstition. A caravan leader might delay departure because of a bad feeling about the sky, and no one questioned him. To counter these fears, people turned to protective rituals. One of the most common was the use of amulets. Small leather pouches hung from children's necks, containing verses or symbols meant to ward off envy. Women embroidered protective patterns into garments or tied blue beads onto crib posts. Men kept small charms hidden in pockets or sewn into belts during long journeys. Houses displayed inscriptions above doorways, sometimes artistic, sometimes crude, but always intentional. Recitations served as shields as well. Before traveling, many people whispered short prayers. Before sleeping, they recited verses they had learned as children. Mothers blew gentle breaths over their children's heads after saying protective phrases. Visitors were handed water believed to carry blessings. Even the act of lighting a lamp at dusk was done with a small invocation meant to push back whatever lingered in the dark. Healing rituals often blurred the line between religion and superstition. A sick child might receive both herbal medicine and whispered supplications. Someone suffering from unexplained nightmares might seek advice from both an imam and a grandmother known for her comforting rituals. People trusted what had worked for generations, whether or not the scholars approved. These layers of belief, half practical, half mystical, created a world where faith and folklore intertwined gracefully, shaping decisions from the smallest household chore to the timing of long journeys. They offered comfort, warning, and a sense of control over a world filled with uncertainties. And it is precisely this blend of fear, hope, and creativity that leads us to the next chapter, where belief meets the body. For just as people sought protection from the unseen, they also sought cures for illness, injuries, and the many ailments that touched daily life. Now, let us step from omens to ointments, from charms to remedies, as we explore the medical knowledge and curious healing practices that sustained the empire. Chapter 23 awaits. From the world of omens and protective charms, we step into another realm, where belief and practice intertwined in fascinating ways: the world of medicine. In the Umayyad era, healthcare was a swirling mixture of Greek philosophy, Persian knowledge, Arabian desert wisdom, and a generous helping of trial and error. Physicians tried their best. Herbalists swore by ancient recipes. And ordinary people navigated a landscape of cures that ranged from remarkably effective to wonderfully questionable. The physician, al-Tabib, was a respected figure, often trained through apprenticeships or by studying translated Greek texts. Many could quote Hippocrates and Galen, while also knowing which shrubs grew near the nearest wadi. They believed the Pui was governed by humors, hot, cold, wet, and dry, and that illness arose when these fell out of balance. A sneeze was sometimes celebrated as the body's way of restoring harmony. Too much phlegm, too much heat, too much dryness. Every symptom had a category, and every category had a cure. Some treatments were surprisingly sophisticated. Physicians prescribed diets tailored to a patient's condition: light soups for fever, cooling cucumbers for heat, warming broths for chills. They set broken bones with impressive skill, stitched wounds with steady hands, and used honey as an antiseptic long before modern science praised its antibacterial properties. They recommended rest, fresh air, gentle exercise, and even forms of physical therapy using stretching and massage. Herbal medicine, meanwhile, was the true heart of healing. The empire kiosks, markets overflowed with remedies: mint to soothe stomachs, fenugreek for chest congestion, licorice root for sore throats, lavender for calm, garlic for infections, and pomegranate peel for digestive troubles. Herbalists, usually older women or traveling specialists, knew the exact time of year each plant held the most potency. They dried leaves in shaded courtyards, boiled bark into thick syrups, and ground seeds with stone mortars until the air filled with aromatic dust. Desert tribes brought their own knowledge. They knew how to treat scorpion stings using poultices made from crushed desert grasses, how to soothe sunstroke with tamarind drinks, and which shrubs could stop bleeding. Their remedies were practical, honed by generations of harsh climate and scarce resources. When city physicians failed, many families sought the wisdom of nomadic healers who understood conditions caused by heat, wind, dust, and long travel. But alongside these effective treatments lived theories that today would raise eyebrows or laughter. Some physicians believed the certain illnesses were caused by wandering womb syndrome, insisting women's organs could shift inside their bodies and needed to be coaxed back into place with scented smoke. Others prescribed pulverized pearls, claiming they strengthened the heart. A few recommended eating ground-up animal bones to treat bone pain. One widely circulated remedy suggested placing a warm onion on the head to cure forgetfulness. Another advised drinking water poured over the ashes of burned olive pits to settle anxiety. People also turned to rituals when medicine felt uncertain. A mother might recite prayers while blowing gently over her child's forehead. An elderly man might hang an herb bundle in his doorway to keep fevers away. Even educated scholars sometimes wore tiny amulets tucked under their robes, just in case, they said with a smile. Hospitals, though still early in development, existed in larger cities. Called bimaristans, they offered treatment to patients regardless of wealth. Some had separate wards for fevers, wounds, and eye conditions, along with small pharmacies stocked with herbs, oils, and powders. Physicians trained there, debating treatments in hushed corners. Scribes recorded patient histories, and orderlies moved through the halls with trays of food and medicine. These early institutions would later inspire the great medical centers of the Abbasid era. Yet for all their progress, physicians learned as much from failure as from success. Experimentation was constant. Remedies were borrowed, tested, adapted, or discarded. People valued results, not theory. If the village herbalist cured a fever with a bowl of spiced broth, she became trusted. If the court physician treated headaches by applying leeches behind the ears, and it worked for some people, he gained prestige. Healing was a blend of science, art, faith, and folklore. It was imperfect, evolving, human. And just as people sought to protect their bodies from illness, the empire also needed protection from external threats. Healing the sick was essential, but so was defending the vast Umayyad territories from raids, rebellions, and ambitious rivals. Now, let us leave the quiet clinics and fragrant herb stalls behind and step into the world of armor, drills, horses, and marching footsteps. Chapter 24 awaits. From the gentle hush of herb shops and the soothing clink of physicians' tools, we now step into a world shaped by steel, dust, discipline, and long stretches of silence. The Umayyad Empire, vast and stretched across continents, relied on its soldiers not only for conquest, but for protection, order, and the steady vigilance that kept borders from fraying. Military life was not all glory. Much of it was routine, monotony, and responsibility carried in the dark hours when others slept. Frontier forts dotted the edges of the empire like sturdy beads on a long necklace. Some were carved into rocky hillsides, others built from mud brick or timber, standing watch over desert passes, river crossings, or rugged coastal cliffs. When a traveler approached one of these forts at dusk, he might see shadows moving along the parapets, hear the distant clang of metal on metal, and feel the faint vibration of disciplined life thrumming behind the walls. Inside, soldiers lived a rhythm that rarely changed. Dawn drills, weapons cleaning, maintenance of horses and equipment, brief moments of camaraderie, and long hours of waiting. The smell of oiled leather and iron hung in the air, shields leaned in neat rows. Spears rested upright like a silent forest. Even laughter, when it came, echoed hollowly against stone corridors. Marching was a constant companion. Soldiers marched between forts, marched across plains, marched into towns to rotate garrisons, marched in parades when governors wanted to display authority. Boots wore thin, sandals frayed, feet grew calloused and numb from endless movement. Some joked that they walked more miles than merchants. Others swore that their dreams consisted solely of placing one foot in front of the other. Night was when the strangeness of military life revealed itself most clearly. Night watch duty tested patience, fear, discipline, and imagination all at once. In isolated forts, the desert wind whistled against the walls, and every soldier believed, at least once, that he saw something moving among the dunes. A stray camel could look disturbingly like a lurking enemy in the moonlight. An owl's sudden cry could set hearts hammering. Some forts kept cats simply because their presence reduced the eerie silence. Watchmen paced back and forth on the ramparts, spears in hand, eyes scanning the horizon. They murmured prayers under their breath, tapped their spears lightly against stone when tired, and sometimes sang soft verses to stay awake. The stars above felt close enough to touch. The darkness below felt deep enough to swallow sound. Inside the barracks, boredom could be just as formidable an opponent as any enemy. Soldiers carved patterns into their shields. They sharpened blades that were already sharp. They wrestled for entertainment, played bone dice, or traded stories of home, stories that grew more sentimental the longer they lived away from family. Food arrived in steady but unexciting rotations: lentils, barley stew, flatbread, occasionally salted meat. A cook's attempt at spiced broth could lift morale for an entire week. Despite the monotony, discipline mattered deeply. Commanders inspected the troops with sharp eyes, ensuring armor fit well. Horses were groomed, and patrol schedules were followed. A lapse in vigilance could mean disaster. Soldiers knew this, and while they joked about their superiors, they respected the structure that kept them alive. In some regions, garrisons were multicultural. Arabs, Berbers, Persians, Syrians, and converts from many lands served together. Around fires, they shared songings, debated whose hometown bread was best, and bonded over the universal experience of cold nights and heavy equipment. Whatever their origin, soldiers forged brotherhood through shared hardship. Yet the Umayyad military was not limited to land forces. Along the empire's coasts, especially in the Mediterranean, another group of warriors trained, sailed, and patrolled the waters that connected continents. Naval life carried its own dangers, routines, and strange traditions. And so, as the night watch continues its slow pacing, and the desert wind curls around the fort's walls, let us leave the soldiers to their vigil and follow the scent of salt, tar, and wooden hulls. Chapter 25 awaits. Leaving behind the dust of frontier forts and the steady rhythm of marching boots, we follow the wind as it turns colder, saltier, and carries with it the creaking of wooden hulls swaying in a restless blue world. For all their desert origins, the Umayyads built a surprisingly formidable naval presence. Fleets that guarded coastlines, ferried troops, escorted pilgrims, and connected distant provinces across the Mediterranean and beyond. Life at sea was its own universe, filled with hardship, wonder, danger, and traditions unlike anything found on land. At dawn, the deck of an Umayyad warship glowed gold beneath the early sun. Sailors stirred from cramped sleeping spaces, some curled beneath tarps, others resting between coils of rope, to stretch their stiff limbs and murmur sleepy greetings. A few rubbed salt from their eyes while the ship's cook, already at work, prepared a simple breakfast of barley porridge or flatbread warmed over a small brazier. Space was precious, comfort was rare, but routine, like the tide, anchored their days. The ships themselves were sturdy, built largely from cedar and pine. Oars lined the sides like long wooden wings. Above them, square or triangular sails caught the wind, snapping open with a sound that travelers remembered for the rest of their lives. Sailors moved with practiced coordination, climbing rigging barefoot, adjusting ropes with calloused hands, and shouting commands over the crash of waves. Their bodies swayed instinctively with the motion of the ship, as though the sea had taught them its dance. Storms were the sailors' greatest fear and greatest teacher. When black clouds gathered and the wind rose like an angry spirit, crews sprang into action. Sails were reefed, ropes tightened, buckets readied. Waves slammed against hulls with thunderous force. Men prayed aloud, their voices blending with the wind. Verses of hope, fragments of childhood supplications, promises whispered to God, if only the ship would stay afloat. In the chaos of a storm, even the bravest sailor felt small and strangely humble. Afterward, when calm returned, they often spoke softly, as if the sea were still listening. Superstitions thrived on the water. Many sailors refused to whistle during a voyage, believing it tempted the wind to misbehave. Others insisted that spilling oil on deck brought terrible luck. A few swore that dolphins were guardians sent by God, while sudden appearances of sharks were considered ominous warnings. Before long journeys, some sailors tied small amulets inside their tunics or braided protective knots into the ends of their ropes. And no matter how educated a ship's commander might be, he rarely dismissed these rituals. Life at sea encouraged respect for anything that promised a little extra protection. Daily life aboard ship was a blend of hard labor and surprising moments of calm. Between shifts, at the oars or the rigging, sailors repaired nets, patched sails, and polished weapons. On longer voyages, they fished off the stern, grilled their catch, and shared stories of distant ports, tales of Byzantine harbors, North African markets, or islands where the water shone an uncanny shade of blue. Some carried musical instruments, simple flutes or drums, to pass the time during long, still nights. When the sea was gentle, the ship rocked like a cradle, and even grown men fell asleep within seconds of lying down. Naval expansion during the Umayyad era changed the character of the empire. Fleets carried armies to Cyprus and Rhodes. Ships guarded trade routes against pirates. Coastal cities grew wealthier as ports buzzed with merchants unloading spices, textiles, oils, and glassware. The sea became not only a frontier, but a bridge linking cultures. Yet with expansion came risk. Pirates lurked in narrow channels. Spies moved between ships disguised as hired dock workers. Foreign envoys observed naval movements from afar. Sailors learned to distrust strangers who asked too many questions. Captains taught their crews to speak carefully in port taverns, lest they reveal a route or a weakness. Life at sea sharpened instincts, broadened horizons, and created a unique breed of people, half warrior, half navigator, half wanderer, whose worldview stretched as far as the horizon line. And where sailors went, secrets traveled with them. Every port held whispers. Every ship carried coded messages. The sea was not only a battleground or a trade artery, it was a perfect stage for quiet intelligence work. So now, as the ship rocks gently beneath a star-splashed sky, and the sailors settle into their night rotations, we turn our attention to the shadowy craft that thrived in both ports and palaces. Chapter 26 awaits. As the sailors drift into exhausted sleep, and the ship's lanterns sway gently in the sea breeze, we step into a different kind of darkness, one where danger is quieter, footsteps softer, and power moves not through armies, but through secrets. Across the Umayyad Empire, political life depended just as much on whispers as on swords. Every city, port, palace, and caravan route held its own hidden world of informants, coded letters, and carefully crafted lies. Spies were not always mysterious figures in cloaks. Many appeared entirely ordinary. A trader who spent long nights in roadside inns. A scholar who traveled for research. A scribe who copied official documents by day and memorized them by night. A servant in the palace who carried trays of food, but also carried messages tucked quietly under a sleeve. Even a humble water carrier could overhear enough gossip in a morning to be useful. Information flowed like water, shaping alliances exposing rebellions, and keeping rulers aware of distant provinces. Some governors felt safer trusting a single skilled informant than an entire battalion. The Caliph's circle kept networks of eyes and ears in every major city: Cordoba, Kairouan, Basra, Damascus. Reports traveled faster than caravans. News outran horses. Secret letters were the tools of this shadowy world, written in tiny, compressed script, often using simple ciphers to confuse uninvited readers. They were rolled tightly and sealed with soft wax. Messengers tucked them inside belt linings, sandal soles, or the hollow reeds of writing pens. Others hid them beneath bread loaves or stitched them into hymns. One famous method involved writing with lemon juice, words invisible until warmed over a flame. Many a household fire revealed secrets never meant to see daylight. Disguises were surprisingly common. A nobleman traveling as a cloth merchant, a courier pretending to be a wandering poet, a spy slipping into a tribal camp disguised as a storyteller or a wandering healer. Whatever identity was needed, someone could assume it quickly. The key was simple: blend in, speak little, listen always. And whisper networks thrived. A tavern keeper who observed which foreign sailors arrived late at night. A mule driver who noticed which caravans changed course unexpectedly. A weaver who overheard a neighbor boasting about rebellious cousins in the mountains. None of these people considered themselves spies, but their observations traveled, shared carefully with the right person for a small coin, a favor, or simply the pleasure of passing on something interesting. Fear and curiosity shaped public behavior in subtle ways. People spoke more softly in markets when discussing politics. Strangers asking too many questions were politely avoided. If someone mentioned a governor's name too loudly, heads turned, not to intervene, but to silently warn. Even letters between relatives sometimes carried coded phrases like, "The figs are sour this year," which actually meant, "Stop writing openly, someone is watching." Yet secrecy did not always breed paranoia. For some, it added excitement to ordinary life. Young scribes whispered conspiracies over tea. Merchants boasted about knowing a friend of a friend who had once carried a secret message. Travelers told stories of nights spent with mysterious companions whose true identities were never revealed. The edges of truth blurred into legend. Spies also operated in palaces, where stakes were highest. Advisors monitored rivals. Concubines gathered information through quiet conversations. And guards overheard plans while standing seemingly motionless in doorways. A single, careless comment in the wrong courtyard could ripple all the way to the caliph's ear. Ministers smiled politely across tables while simultaneously plotting alliances behind curtains. Yet for all the drama of espionage, much of it existed in the physical spaces of cities, in the twisting alleys where shadows lingered, the rooftop pathways used by quick-footed messengers, the crowded markets where spies disappeared instantly into noise and color. Architecture shaped secrecy. Layout shaped opportunity. And so, to understand how spies moved, we must understand the cities themselves, their designs, their rhythms, their hidden corners. Let us now step from whispering agents into the very bones of the Umayyad world, the walls, streets, homes, and monuments that shaped daily life for millions. Chapter 27 awaits. From the murmur of spies slipping through shadows we rise into the bright, intricate world that shaped their movements, the cities themselves. The Umayyad Empire was a patchwork of urban brilliance. Damascus with its grand avenues, Cordoba with its river bridges, Kairouan with its proud mosques, and Basra with its palm-shaded canals. Each city followed its own rhythm, yet they all shared a style of architecture that favored beauty, privacy, and practicality in equal measure. We begin in a narrow alley just after sunrise. Light filters in slivers between mud brick walls, catching on hanging baskets and open windows. The smell of bread drifts from a nearby oven. Two neighbors exchange greetings over a rooftop wall, their conversation floating down like soft birdsong. Streets twist and turn deliberately, designed to create shade, break winds, and protect homes from the relentless sun. No straight Roman grids here. Umayyad cities favored the labyrinth, partly for climate, partly for defense, partly because ancient paths simply grew where feet naturally walked. Mosques stood at the heart of urban life, anchors around which neighborhoods formed. Their courtyards provided cool sanctuaries in summer. Their columns cast long shadows, and their fountains offered both ritual cleansing and a moment of quiet reflection. The architecture celebrated both function and spirituality. Domes capturing echoes of recitation, arches guiding breezes, minarets rising like fingers pointing gently toward the sky. In many cities, the mosque was not only a place of prayer, but a school, a meeting hall, and a resting spot for travelers who arrived too late to find a proper inn. Palaces added a different kind of splendor. While the grand audience halls were meant to impress, the private residential sections were built with quiet intimacy in mind. Gardens and courtyards offered peaceful retreat, spaces filled with rustling palms, clear pools, orange blossoms, and patterned tiles that shimmered like scattered gems. Rooms opened inward, protecting the privacy of families while shutting out the noise of the city. Even the smallest home borrowed from this philosophy, arranging rooms around a modest courtyard where sunlight, water, and shade worked together to create comfort. Bathhouses, or hammams, buzzed with activity throughout the day. Here, privacy took on another meaning. Communal cleansing with strict etiquette. Steam filled the domed rooms. Light pierced through small, star-shaped openings in the ceiling. People soaked, scrubbed, chatted softly, or relaxed in silence as warm water washed away dust and worries. Walls plastered with lime kept the heat in, and floors, warmed from below, made winter baths a delight. These places were more than hygiene centers. They were social hubs where news and laughter flowed as freely as the water. Markets, too, shaped the city's identity. Long, covered bazaars protected merchants and shoppers from sun and rain. Wooden slats overhead created shifting patterns of shadow that danced across spices, textiles, ceramics, and copper goods. Secret corners hid tiny workshops where craftsmen hammered, carved, or dyed in near darkness. Some stalls nearly touched each other overhead, forming tunnels where cool breezes funneled through. Others opened into wide plazas where storytellers drew crowds and children chased pigeons past fountains. Yet for all the openness of public spaces, Umayyad architecture deeply respected privacy. Houses rarely faced each other directly. Windows often opened inward rather than onto streets. Homes used thick walls to block heat and noise, while small rooftop terraces served as nighttime bedrooms during sweltering summers. Behind plain exteriors lay surprisingly lush interiors, a reminder that much of the beauty of this world existed behind closed doors, protected from dust and wandering eyes. Hidden corners abounded. Rooftop pathways allowed quiet shortcuts at dawn. Archways led to half-forgotten courtyards with ancient fig trees. Narrow lanes could funnel breezes in the hottest hours, yet turn cold at night. Children invented entire worlds in these tucked-away places, while adults appreciated their quiet utility. Even spies used them. Those twisting side streets and shaded alcoves made perfect hiding spots when someone needed to vanish discreetly. These architectural choices were not random. They were responses to the climate, the culture, the rhythms of daily life. They protected families from heat, preserved water, encouraged social bonds, and carved out sanctuaries of calm within the chaos of a bustling empire. And now, as we pause beneath a lattice-screened balcony where cool air filters through carved wood, it becomes clear. To understand Umayyad cities, we must also understand the environment that shaped them. Heat, cold, rain, dryness, all demanded clever adaptation. So let us step from stone corridors into the open air, turning our attention to the sky, the seasons, and the ingenious ways people adjusted to their demanding world. Chapter 28 awaits. Stepping out of the shaded alleys and cool courtyards, we meet the force that shaped nearly every habit in the Umayyad world. The climate, heat, wind, and dust were not mere inconveniences. They were architects, sculptors, and daily companions that dictated how cities were built, how people dressed, how they worked, and how they rested. Life in the empire unfolded beneath a sun that could be merciless by noon, and beneath winds that carried both relief and calamity. The heat rose early. By mid-morning, sunlight radiated off stone walls with such intensity that people planned their errands before. The day truly began. Clay jars of water were buried halfway in the earth to stay cool. Vendors set up awnings of woven palm leaves. Children were scolded gently when they strayed too far without a head covering. Even animals sought refuge. Donkeys pressed themselves against shaded walls, cats curled under carts, and camels knelt patiently near wells. To counter this heat, people invented clever architectural tools. One of the most remarkable was the wind catcher, a tall, narrow tower built onto houses to funnel breezes inside. Even the faintest wind could be captured, cooled slightly as it traveled down the tower, and delivered into rooms that would otherwise feel like ovens. In desert towns, these structures transformed homes into unexpected sanctuaries of comfort. Shaded courtyards were another solution. Surrounded by high walls and planted with trees, they created a cool microclimate. The combination of shade, tiled floors, and central fountains lowered temperatures dramatically. Families often spent hot afternoons in these courtyards, sharing fruit, preparing food, or simply resting. The gentle splash of water soothed frayed nerves, its sound becoming a lullaby repeated across generations. But heat was not the only challenge. Dust storms rolled across plains and deserts with terrifying speed. One moment, the sky was clear. The next, a wall of sand approached like a living creature. People knew the signs: a sudden stillness in the air, a faint orange tint creeping across the horizon, animals growing restless. When it hit, doors slammed shut, windows were sealed with cloth, and courtyards filled with swirling grit. Children were pulled indoors, water vessels covered, food protected. Wind shaped routines too. In some months, the Shamal winds blew for days, sending fine sand into eyes, ears, clothing, and food, no matter how tightly everything was covered. People developed rituals for these times: extra oil on the skin to protect from drying, scarves wrapped around noses and mouths, lamps kept lit despite flickering flames. Conversations quieted, tempers occasionally shortened, as if the wind carried impatience with it. And yet, in the evenings, nature offered mercy. As the sun dipped, rooftops became the coolest places in a home. Families climbed narrow stairs, carrying cushions and light blankets. They ate fruit slices chilled in clay pots, told stories while stars blinked awake, and lay under a night breeze that felt like forgiveness. Sleeping on rooftops was common, sometimes necessary, and always cherished during summer's peak. A night beneath the open sky restored the mind in ways no palace chamber could match. Water management was another masterpiece of adaptation. Cities built channels to guide river water. Villages dug underground tunnels called qanats to carry cool water from distant hills. People stored water in porous clay jugs that produced natural cooling through slow evaporation. Even the act of sharing water became a cultural ritual, symbolizing generosity in a land where every drop mattered. Rain, rare but beloved, brought its own rituals. Children ran barefoot, parents collected rainwater in bowls, and elders lifted their faces to the sky as if greeting an old friend. Some believed rain carried blessings that cleansed both land and heart. Entire moods shifted with the seasons: the exhaustion of summer, the relief of winter rains, the hope carried on spring breezes. Through all these challenges, people adapted with remarkable creativity. Clothing became loose and breathable. Fabrics chosen for airflow and modesty. Work schedules shifted to avoid peak heat. Travelers moved at dawn or dusk. Even social gatherings adjusted, with midday hours reserved for rest and cooler times chosen for visits and festivities. And within this dance with nature, childhood unfolded in ways shaped by environment as much as culture. Children learned to read the sky as early as they learned to read the Quran. They chased shadows during the hottest hours, saved their wildest games for sunset, and mastered the art of making fun out of whatever climate permitted. So let us leave the wind catchers humming softly above shaded homes and step now into the world of the youngest members of the Umayyad Empire. Their joys, challenges, mischief, and dreams. Chapter 29 awaits. From the shifting winds and clever tricks of survival, we step into a softer world, the world of children. While adults worried about heat, trade, and politics, the youngest members of the Umayyad Empire lived in a universe shaped by chores, games, laughter, and the endless curiosity that fills every childhood, no matter the century. Their days were bright with discovery, though woven with responsibilities that might surprise us today. Most children rose early, often before sunrise, helping with small tasks that kept the household running smoothly. A boy might feed goats, sweep the courtyard, or carry water from a nearby well. A girl might help her mother knead dough, fold bedding, or fetch herbs from the garden. But these chores rarely felt like burdens. They were simply part of life, tiny rituals that tied children to their families and neighborhoods. Schooling varied widely. Many children attended lessons in the mosque, learning to recite Quran on wooden tablets coated with soft clay. Others apprenticed under craftsmen, carpenters, potters, tailors, absorbing practical skills by watching older hands work. Some villages hired tutors who taught basic writing, arithmetic, and grammar beneath shady trees or in quiet courtyards. Discipline could be strict, but students also found plenty of reasons to grin, exchanging whispered jokes behind their tablets or sneaking pomegranate seeds during long recitations. Yet it was in play that childhood truly blossomed. Children dashed through alleys barefoot, chasing each other in elaborate games of tag. They fashioned toys from whatever they could find. Carved wooden animals, pebbles arranged into game grids, little cloth dolls stuffed with wool. They played with hoops, threw stones at marked targets, and reenacted heroic battles they heard in poems and stories. Even the heat of midday couldn't stop them. During the hottest hours, they simply moved their games into shaded corridors or under the long shadows of walls. Boys often played wrestling games, racing through courtyards or pretending to be warriors defending imaginary forts. Girls played hand-clap rhythms, acted out family scenes with dolls, or practiced the arts of storytelling, emerging as miniature poets long before adulthood. And in some places, both boys and girls played together, especially in rural communities where everyone knew each other and boundaries felt softer. Mischief was universal. Children dipped their fingers into honeypots when adults weren't looking. They climbed fig trees to snatch fruit before it was ripe. They snuck onto rooftops they weren't supposed to explore and laughed breathlessly when spotted from below. And always, they whispered secrets. Who saw whose brother talking to whose cousin? Who stole a date from the market? Who found a shiny coin near the well? Their world overflowed with tiny dramas that seemed very large when experienced at knee height. Discipline depended on family and region. Some adults believed in gentle correction, guiding with stories or religious lessons. Others believed in firm structure, expecting children to listen the first time. But affection was constant. Mothers combed hair with oils, fathers lifted toddlers onto their shoulders during festivals, and older siblings helped younger ones with lessons or chores. Even scoldings were usually followed by warm reassurance. A cup of cool water, a shared piece of bread, a smile that softened the moment. Children dreamed big. A boy might imagine himself becoming a famous warrior, a scholar, a merchant who traveled across the sea, or a poet whose verses would echo in palaces. A girl might dream of becoming a skilled weaver, a respected teacher, or a matriarch known for wisdom and hospitality. And though their dreams were shaped by their time, the feelings behind them, hope, ambition, wonder, were timeless. Evenings were the magical hour of childhood. When the heat faded, whole families gathered on rooftops or in courtyards. Children played their final games beneath lantern glow, then curled against parents or siblings as storytellers recited tales of prophets, heroes, travelers, and jinn. These stories formed the moral backbone of childhood, teaching courage, faith, cleverness, and humility. They also shaped imagination, sending children to sleep with minds full of vibrant worlds. And as children drifted into dreams, the adults looked on with quiet reflection. For them, childhood was not only a stage of life, but a reminder of innocence, of joy, of the passing of seasons, of the cycle that continued long before the Umayyads and long after. And now, with the children tucked safely into their beds, the soft glow of the lantern fading, we find ourselves nearing the end of our long journey through the empire's strange, beautiful, and very human daily life. It is time to step back, breathe gently, and reflect on everything we have wandered through together. Chapter 30 awaits. As the laughter of children fades and night settles gently across the rooftops, we step into the final stretch of our journey. The Umayyad Empire, so vast and varied in the stories we've explored together, now softens under the warm embrace of dusk. Lanterns flicker alive one by one, like fireflies awakening across cities, villages, and desert camps. The heat of the day loosens its grip, and the breeze carries the memory of all the distant places that make up this sprawling world. In Damascus, the air turns cool as the sun sinks behind Mount Qasiyun. Families gather in courtyards, passing plates of figs and cool water drawn from clay jars. Mothers lower woven blinds to block the last rays of light, while fathers settle onto cushions, letting the tensions of the day melt slowly from their shoulders. In the great mosques, imams' voices echo gently beneath towering domes, calling hearts toward calm reflection. Far to the west in Cordoba, the Guadalquivir glows with threads of gold. The sound of distant bells mixes with the rustle of palm leaves. Craftsmen close their shops, wiping the dust from their hands before joining friends outside for evening stories. The city hums not with noise, but with a peaceful togetherness born from centuries of shared ritual. In Kairouan, orange lanterns illuminate whitewashed alleys. The square near the mosque fills with the soft murmur of conversation. Carpets are shaken out for the night, and rooftop beds are prepared with blankets that feel cool to the touch. Children, exhausted from play, drag their feet up the stairs, their eyelids heavy, their minds still swirling with imagined adventures. And in the desert, the last light stretches long shadows across the sand. A Bedouin camp settles into its familiar rhythm. Camels kneel, ropes creak, and the fire crackles as coffee bubbles in a brass pot. The wind softens to a quiet sigh. Stars ignite overhead, one by one, bright and sharp, against a velvet sky unclouded by smoke or walls. Stories begin, slow, wandering, full of wisdom, carried through generations. All across the empire, these scenes play out in harmony. Despite the differences we've explored between cities and tribes, between palaces and tents, between scholars and sailors, the rhythm of evening unites everyone. It is the hour when the world exhales, the hour when the noise of trade, travel, argument, laughter, and labor fades into something gentler, something almost sacred. As we walk quietly through these nighttime landscapes, it becomes easy to see the beauty beneath the strangeness of Umayyad life. The peculiar habits, the odd routines, the unexpected customs. They form a portrait of a civilization alive with creativity, resilience, and curiosity. A world where people adapted brilliantly to harsh climates, where community mattered deeply, where knowledge traveled from hand to hand like a precious light. Think of the rooftops glowing under moonlight, the courtyards perfumed with orange blossoms, the winding alleys that sheltered secrets, the markets overflowing with colors and voices, the caravans crossing silent deserts under a canopy of stars, the endless stitching together of lives, rich, poor, urban, nomadic, across lands so wide they seemed impossible to govern, yet somehow pulsed with a shared identity. And now, after wandering through dawns, bazaars, palaces, schools, hammams, caravans, and quiet homes, we arrive at this peaceful moment of stillness, a moment to breathe, to settle, to feel the gentle weight of history resting beside us. The lanterns burn low, conversations quiet, footsteps grow soft. Somewhere, a storyteller murmurs the final lines of a tale. Somewhere else, a child clings to the last moments before sleep. The empire grows dim, not with darkness, but with the soft glow of rest. So let the calm wrap around you like a warm, woven cloak. Let the world of the Umayyads drift slowly into the distance, carried off by the night breeze. You have traveled far, seen much, and now you may rest, just as the empire rests beneath its blanket of stars. Close your eyes, breathe gently, and let the quiet take you.